Welcome, everyone. I wish, as the moderator of this panel, to welcome our four panelists, as well as our online audience, to this new Trinitarian Ontologies panel. New Trinitarian Ontologies names a new way of speaking about the structure of being or metaphysics in imitation of God as Trinity. It speaks not of an ontology of the Trinity, but of Trinitarian ontology. It thus steps outside of the standard lines of formal ontologies, for it speaks from the hinterlands of contemporary theory and from the margins of academic theology as the subterranean tradition of Christian philosophy, which, while once submerged in late medieval nominalism and early modern idealism, has since the late modern critiques of formal and foundational ontologies newly erupted in the present day of free speculation. To ask this question of Trinitarian ontologies, to ask the simplest question of what is being, as it yet may be answered with the absolute question of what is God. It begins with what seems the simplest and richest of philosophical questions, for it speaks with Aristotle of what simply is, and with Augustine of the supreme cause of being itself. Starting, however, with Scotus, Suarez, and Leibniz, this speech of being in general metaphysics came to be distinguished as a transcendental science of ontology. Once, however, ontology had been separated from theology, God could begin to be conceived as the supreme being of all beings in a theology of ontology. New Trinitarian Ontologies attempts to speak of being that cannot be simulated within this speech of ontology. Such a spectral conception of God as ontotheology is, as Nietzsche and Heidegger had recognized, the oldest root of modern atheism. For in elevating the idea of one supreme being over many particulate beings, God appears both in and beyond all beings, in an ontological difference of being over and against beings, an inner opposition of being to being, and an opposition that ultimately evacuates being into nothing. The God of ontology is, as Jacobi had warned, thus an idol of pure reason that evacuates being into this between, that is not being but nothing, so as to subvert any system of being as ontology into a system of non-being or nihilism. That is, at last makes it impossible to speak of ontology in any way that is recognizably Trinitarian. The Trinity has, for this reason, remained hidden in much of modern ontology. Most analytic ontology has, following Frege, presupposed the forms of logic as an axiomatic foundation, while most continental ontology has, following Husserl, alternatively presupposed the content of phenomenal intuition as an appearing foundation. Such foundations of formal ontologies have, however, since been subverted by Gödel's critique of the foundations of mathematics and Heidegger's critique of the construction of ontology. Wilfred von Orman Quine and Jacques Derrida have hinted at the dissolution of all such foundational ontologies. Wilfred Sellers and Gilles Deleuze have gestured to many new modes of materialism, both rhizomatic and eliminative. And Richard Rorty and Elaine Badiou have heralded a return to practice and realism in metaphysics that harkens back to the ancient and realistic foundations of metaphysics as of Trinitarian theology. The question of Trinitarian ontology has in this way since opened up from within the fissures of secular philosophy. It was first explicitly raised in a 1976 letter by Bishop Klaus Himmerl to Hans Urs von Balthasar. Himmerl had found in Balthasar's a recollection of an event-like character of Christian doctrine that transforms the speech of being from out of the heart of our faith, from the Christ event, as it is read in a Trinitarian fashion. Trinitarian ontology is, for Himmerl, as for Danelou and de Lubac, a kind of ressourcement, a rethinking, a recollection of the Trinitarian shaping of ontology as it asks again so as to answer anew this ontological question in imitation of the Trinity. Its novelty arises in the very asking of this question of ontology as the structure of being that is to be shaped by the Trinity. It aims to recollect what was lost and what may yet be recovered for a Christian answer to the question of faith, where the Trinity is said to shape ontology. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this third way of speaking about being as a gift that may imitate in its relation the triple relationality of the first persons of God as Trinity. Theology may thus mark a momentous reversal of modern ontology, for it uniquely asks the question of faith in a God who speaks of being before we may ever begin to ask this very question of being at all. And yet, its doctrinal answers also speak through this very difference of the many ways in which we can say that God is many made one and God is Trinity. New Trinitarian Ontologies names this recollection from the sources of the thinking of ontology as Trinitarian. It is a new narration of ontology as Trinitarian, for it narrates the story of Trinitarian ontology in its patristic formation, its medieval submergence, and in its modern eruption, from which the Spirit always abides to reflect upon and draw forth a new development that ever was in the hidden destiny of its final truth. Its newness may come both before and after modern ontology, for its novelty is a product of its own relations, and yet it is most of all in search through this trace of its own historical development that we can find the fissures that point forward to the ontology that is shaped by the Trinity. The The Trinity is, in this way, free from all foundations, for the form of the Trinity is never founded upon any form of logic or content of phenomena apart from the free love of the divine persons. Trinitarian ontologies may be at once more Christian, more incarnational, and yet more open to critically engage with the cutting-edge theoretical efforts of our time. The new Trinitarian Ontologies online panel that we will host today will consist of 4 20 to 30-minute papers, followed by 10 to 15 minutes of question and answers from the panel and our online audience. And I'll be taking questions from the chat box in YouTube. For our first paper, I invite Professor John Milbank to give a paper on Bulgakov and his critique of ficta. Professor Milbank has previously taught at the universities of Lancaster, Cambridge, Virginia, and Nottingham. He is the Emeritus Professor of Religion, Politics, and Ethics at the University of Nottingham, a visiting professor at the Edith Stein Institute of Philosophy at Grenada, and he also serves as the president of the Center for Theology and Philosophy. Professor John Milbank.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Ryan, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all in virtual Bologna. Just sad we can't be there for the real thing. The short paper I'm going to read now is entitled From Grammar to Wisdom, The Philosophy of Language and Trinitarian Ontology in the work of Sergius Bulgakov. I'll be largely referring to his earlier philosophical writings, that's to say the philosophy of the name, unfading light, and the tragedy of philosophy. Although a lot of what he has to say, particularly in the tragedy of philosophy, is later recapitulated in a long 3-part article in German, Capita de Trinitate, that he wrote towards the latter half of his career, quite near the end of his life, in fact. So, in the philosophy of the name, Bulgakov invokes the charge, explicitly citing Hamann, Herder, and von Humboldt. He invokes the charge that Immanuel Kant's entire critique of metaphysics rests upon an ignoring of the philosophical import of language. In relation to both Kant and Fichte, this means for Bulgakov that everything will become much clearer if we replace the supposed existential primacy of logic with what he takes to be the more real existential primacy of grammar. Again and again, the Russian theologian suggests that the overextension of logic in German idealism, from Kant through to Hegel, leads to all sorts of argumentative legerdemain, of which he is as disdainful from the eastern margins of Europe as the British tend to be from the Western. According to Bulgakov, one should not pretend to be able to deduce even the knowledge of objects from our subjectivity, as Kant and Fichte seek to do, nor imagine that any proposed deduction of ontological categories can be any more than the Aristotelian rhapsody of classification, which from Kant onwards the idealists sought turn by turn to try to escape. Yet this is now for Bulgakov for a more than Aristotelian reason. It is because prior to any classification of things into substance, accident, and relation, and the degrees lying between, lies the already lived grammatical arrangement of things into subject, predicate, and copula. Every predicate is for Bulgakov a kind of universal idea. And the hypostatic subject he takes to be still more universal and open in character. However, there exists for Bulgakov no simple order of priority between subject and predicate. And therefore, the subject in his philosophy does not play any straightforward role of substance to which things just accidentally attach. For, according to him, there can be no real living subject prior to received and selected attachments. And therefore, any unproblematic sifting between substance and attribute or between external and constitutive relations, that kind of sifting is grammatically disturbed from the very outset. Thus, the very last phrase, concluding phrase of The Tragedy of Philosophy reads, substance is a living proposition consisting of a subject, a predicate, and a copula. Bulgakov's case, explicitly following Hamann, Herder, and Humboldt, is that philosophy goes astray if it seeks to transcend or escape the cultural because linguistic mediation of things. In a sense, he reads Johann Fichte, who was very alert to the proto-romantic critique of Kant, as half conceding this point, because the German idealist had rightly concluded that when we say, for example, the table is in the dining room, we're really saying, I can see that the table is in the dining room, in such a way that our subjectivity is always concluded. And what is more, we are imbuing the table in a certain sense with our own subjectivity. Otherwise, we really wouldn't be able to register the table at all. We have to some extent, identify with the table, treat it as if, almost as if it were a person. However, Bulgakov adds to Fichte that this circumstance reveals that we inevitably subscribe to a grammatical ontology that we cannot seriously refuse without lapsing into incoherence. The subject, predicate, copula structure of all human language reveals indeed that we can only perceive the world at all by animating it. And it's for this reason that in Unfading Light, Bulgakov cautiously endorses rather occultist and esoteric modes of natural philosophy. It's because he literally thinks the world is composed of language. And there are strongly Kabbalistic influences on Bulgakov from beginning to end of his writings. However, this ontological propositionality of reality also for Bulgakov tells against idealism and against Fichte. And a kind of admitted exacerbation of Fichtean insights, which the self-named romantics Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel had already sketched. We need to see that the only available subjectivity that we can inhabit is, to put it in the later terms of Jacques Lacan, the subject of the statement and not the sublimely inaccessible, though always assumed subject of enunciation. If we do admit that we begin always already with the linguistic subject as the only fully available I, then still more drastically than Fichte, we will have to also admit the equal co-reality from the outset of the not I, now taken in the mode of the predicates. At this point, I should note that Bulgakov was prodigious in realizing that Fichte is already halfway to realism. that you mustn't read Fichte as an out-and-out idealist. You must read Fichte as articulating an aporia between absolute idealism and a reversion to realism. This is exactly the way that Bulgakov reads Fichte already, but he seeks to exacerbate, to increase the latent realist element within Fichte. And he tries to do that by insisting that you've got to think of things more grammatically. For it's not just that the not I taken as the predicate always blocks our cognitive advance, requiring our integral retreat always into an ironic subjective reserve. It's also the case that without adopting some sort of attachment to predicates, without appropriating them as properties of our selfhood, without, as Bulgakov sees it, without naming oneself, we will not enter into subjectivity at all. We surpass negative irony of a Fichtean kind, as Friedrich Schlegel taught, when we positively embrace flashes of linguistic wit that are fragments of revelatory and participatory disclosure. Then our lives and the reality we inhabit can turn into continuous symbolic allegories. So it was already by more strongly invoking language that the Romantics moved further into realism against German idealism, as the more recent scholarship of people like Manfred Frank has so clearly shown. From such a perspective, there is in fact no easy distinction to be made between the subject and predicate positions, either in grammar or in ontological reality. Thus, in the philosophy of the name, Bulgakov stresses that every word as an idea is transcendentally prior to its grammatical position as a part of speech. It's a very anti-structuralist theory of language. This also means for him that the inflection of a word is genetically prior to linguistic structure, and that for this reason, it's for this reason that the older languages are always the inflected ones. There is a wholesale fluidity between absolutely individual substance and the universal qualities that attach to it. They can always confusingly change places because they so radically require each other, just as a noun may turn into a verb or vice versa. Indeed, Bulgakov maintains that the claimed identity between subject and predicate that allows us to make any sorts of sense of anything at all is nonetheless grounded in an apparent nonsense that transcends the law of non-contradiction. There's something really rather kind of proto-postmodern about Bulgakov at this point. In order to achieve any locatable identity in the first place, the human subject or the thing taken in the subject position has to claim that something also is, without reserve, what it also is not. The table is round and brown, etc. It's also, as table, neither of those things, and yet without them, it cannot really be there at all. Likewise, I myself am not exhaustively my name, my history, my location, etc. I'm not these things at all. I might not have any of them. And yet without these things, I would also simply vanish. In terms of such considerations, Bulgakov declares that any name is at once both a proper name and an empty abstract name, descriptive and universal, with only a series of relative variations of respective emphasis. It's fascinating to think that that perhaps outflanks all the arguments that you find in analytic philosophy after Saul Kripke and so forth. In terms, therefore, of the three fundamental grammatical and ontological positions, Bulgakov considers that he has exceeded and corrected Johann Fichte. First, the mysteriously fundamental subject whose circle we can never exit is nonetheless a co-situated subject, in a sense less inherently problematic than it was for the German philosopher. If it has absolute depths coinciding with the divine presence, then this is not a problematic implied identity with God that we must ceaselessly and hopelessly endeavor to realize, as for Fichte, but a given participation in his infinity mediated to us by symbolic nature and by the inspired signs and allegories of revealed religion. Secondly, predicated objects are radically external to us, and yet even their resistance is a gift of shared community in being. Our ceaseless advance towards the perspective of the Divine Father is therefore also a quest for the perfectly answering and supplementing other. The Christian revelation has astonishingly shown that this need not imply a quandary, whereby we alternatively lose the world in the absolute divine subjectivity, as for Fichte, or else abandon transcendence through an attempted pantheistic dilation, as with Spinoza. For we now realize that God himself is the infinitization of our own grammatical circumstance that we share with the whole world. God is only an absolute paternal hypostasis because he is also filial and spiritual subjectivity. Thus, where philosophy seeks to overcome grammar by absolutizing one or other of the grammatical poles, either the subject with Fichte, the logical predicate or the copula, the logical predicate as with Hegel, or yet again, the vital being of their copula or combination, Schelling, Spinoza, or the pre-Socratics, Christian theology keeps all three elements of grammar in play. This is the absolute central point of Bulgakov's philosophy. The truth is not a logical displacement of our ontological grammar, which already embodied a mode of faith. It is rather the doctrine revealed to religious faith that this grammar and so finite reality remains fully in triple play because it is a participation in an infinite triunity. Thus, thirdly, the spiritual moment in God infinitizes also the copula. For Bulgakov, the linkage between subject and predicate is neither aporetic, as it is for Fichte, nor governed by logical negation, as it is for Hegel, nor yet either fated or darkly willed by nature, as it is for Schelling. Instead, the linkage is one of natural creativity throughout the world and of specific conscious creative art in the case of human beings. In all of nature, the immanent and actively receptive hypostasizing power of God, to be named Sophia, is at work to link subject and predicate together as ineffable beauty and to overcome the ugliness intrinsic to matter as opposed to body, according to Bulgakov, that is the result of the fall. Explicitly, like Dostoevsky, Bulgakov says that beauty is going to save the world. In human beings, as described especially in Unfading Light, this is simultaneously the work of conscious self-creation and of the recreation of nature in anticipation and even a kind of prospective enabling of the final resurrection. It's the kind of very, very Russian vision that you see, say, in Tarkovsky's film, Andrei Rublev, this kind of linking of human creativity to the hope for the resurrection. Our selfhood is not entirely and tautologically self-made, as for Fichte, as from the very outset we co-create ourselves alongside our environment, and all of this process is but a participated, if active, reception of the divine creative act. On the other hand, we don't just, as for Fichte, posit external things according to an intentionality that's merely an internal imaginative creativity, which half accepts these things as resisting us and half tries to deduce them from pre-given a priori structures of subjectivity. The only external creativity involved in this Fichtean scheme is a sheerly arbitrary attempt to reduce the impact of all external obstacles, to simply will them away, economically to master and control them. And there's a kind of anticipation of the phenomenological outlook in Fichte. By contrast, Bulgakov's sociological and more romantic and more realist vision actually increases beyond Fichte and with Novalis and Schlegel the sense of an external creative power over things, which even as already with Novalis is granted a kind of magical reach. Thus, we do more than posit those things in the world with which we identify. In reshaping them and bringing them under our purposive and spiritual control, we actually bring them to birth in participation of the eternal paternal generation of the Son. That's the way Bulgakov puts it. And it's indeed this, you might think curiously, higher magical or specifically named theurgic dimension, which serves to link Bulgakov's critique of philosophy to his particular mode of Christian piety. His so far untranslated book, The Philosophy of the Name, it's translated into French, is a long and extremely sophisticated defense of the Russian name worshippers in terms of a complete philosophy of language. This was the argument about the import of the Jesus prayer in early 20th century Russia. It's legitimate, Bulgakov thinks, to say that the name of Jesus is God, though not, like the more extreme advocates of this piety, including Rasputin, to say that God is the name of Jesus, because this is to confuse subject with predicate. We should not say that the absolute paternal hypostasis is exhaustively in the name, any more than he is the incarnate God-man, or even the second person of the Trinity. Nevertheless, the predicate position is not subordinate to the subject position and can even be raised to co-hypostasicity, as most perfectly achieved, of course, within the Trinitarian God himself, since it is there paradoxically required to exist as a co-subject out of the existence of the primal subject himself. In other words, in God, the equality of the predicate with the subject becomes so extreme that the predicate is completely and fully another subject. Similarly, I am not my name, and yet without my name in the widest sense, I really am not me at all. Unidentified, I am so lost that I do not really exist. For existence or being is not, as for Hegel, an empty starting point identical with nothing, but instead always arises as the third position of attachment. Being for Bulgakov then comes third, although because it's the spirit of the position of the Holy Spirit, it is nonetheless equal with the personal source and with the expression that is the Logos. Since, as we've seen, a name for Bulgakov is indeterminately general or proper, descriptive or vacuously nominative, he insists, following Plato's Cratylus, that no word and no name is ever purely arbitrary. Language cannot have been simply invented by human beings. And here he again follows Hamann, because everything human already presupposes the existence of language, and we cannot really imagine a world outside our articulation of the world. For Bulgakov, it is literally the world that speaks through us, and all language is originally poetic manifestation. Every word is really a disclosure of the idea behind things, which things themselves cannot fail to proclaim. In consequence, a defense of the Platonic sense of the universal in Bulgakov goes along with a defense of the primacy of language. A forest is not for him a manifold exemplification of an abstract idea of a tree, nor is it plausibly an accidental evolution. Instead, it's actually more rigorous to think of every tree as really striving to realize one single absolutely named most proper tree with which it is somehow identical. For were trees only realizing a blueprint, then one might ask why they so constantly vary and alter, or why they generate in time at all. Never mind the question of why they retain a regularity, which would be his reason for refusing a Darwinian position. Similarly, Bulgakov thinks that the Bible is right to speak of languages as fragments of one lost original language, rather than being various attempts to express a shared abstract conceptuality. Outside language, such a conceptuality is meaningless. So the fact that translation is possible suggests a constant human struggle to reunify language and recover a lost shared tongue. This attempt, of course, Bulgakov thinks was initially realized on the day of Pentecost. So for him, the restoration of language is literally central to the work of redemption. It follows that for Bulgakov, the name Jesus is the name of names and the word of words, which unites us to the eternal word and begins to usher in the eschatological and more final reversal of the catastrophe of Babel. Just as the incarnation is only an abstract affirmation, unless Christ continues to be manifest to us through the shapes of ritual and of icons, which themselves, of course, bear named inscriptions, so also it must be conveyed through specific language. The name Jesus Christ, like all names, sustains a complex freight of association, including both acquired and buried onomatopoeic resonance. This is why in the Bible, God names the world into being, and why throughout the texts of the Bible, naming and renaming are clearly regarded as ontological and revelatory events. All this, for Bulgakov, suggests the need to form a biblical metaphysics pre-intimated by Plato, which in exalting naming or the proposition exceeds mere rational or logical classification. Reality as such, spoken into being by an infinite subject, is itself linguistic or proposition. It's surely highly significant that somewhat before Bulgakov, the Italian priest-philosopher Antonio Rosmini had come to a really rather similar conclusion in his massive treatise Theosophia, and also in part through a reflection on Fichte, and also in explicit connection with the elaboration of a Trinitarian ontology. In Rosmini's account of the categories, you have to see the subject articulating as absolutely primary in a way that goes beyond Aristotle. Now, what prevents in Bulgakov an unambiguous hypostasization of the figure of Sophia, the idea that Sophia would be a fourth person of the Trinity. What prevents that is important grammatical qualification of any outright personalism, which would despise the blind witness of things and so of sacramentality. It's in this respect very important that his primary vestigium Trinitatis is not social and relational, even though he does build up to that, such that the ultimate predicate is indeed the thou, and the ultimate copula is indeed the he or she, which then allows the sociological, shared, essential, but personal we to come into being. Nonetheless, Bulgakov's consistently very high valuation of the bodily, the sensual, the sexual, the feminine, as he saw it in his time, and the sacramental requires him to insist that the personal cannot emerge at all without a sort of sublimated fetishistic attachment to things, which alone supplies us with any character or operable content. Imagine anybody you know and imagine trying to think about their character without any account of what things they like and what things they don't like. You just cannot do it. So Adam, Bulgakov declares, was lost in Eden, which lacked for him any charm until the arrival of the disclosive Eve. He didn't simply require a personal companion, but rather an ultimate attachment to another freely self-expressive, embodied thing like himself, with which he could be corporeally united. In a lesser way, all our speaking involves a continuous appropriation of things, including of those things that are spoken of in terms of their appropriation by other things, like the inclusion of the table in the dining room. For this reason, Bulgakov declares that the whole of a human life is actually one long string of propositions, or alternatively, one long continuous single proposition. But this is not just a process of realization. It's also a further disclosure of the world through its further poetic recreation. It is ontology as autobiography and shared history, because reality itself is both autobiographical and historical. In consequence, the second predicable mental moment is first impersonal before it is personal, and is even identified with essence, with which the primary hypostasis of the self must identify if it is to become a real person at all. This means that perhaps rather surprisingly, Bulgakov consistently associates the divine essence, both divine and created, with the second person of the Trinity, including the creative echo of the Logos. One might say that for him, and in very Johannine terms, we have to see that the Son is the complete word and utterance of the Father before we can grasp the complete import of his personhood and eternal birth. The essential rather than the purely personal also matters to Bulgakov insofar as, according to Trinitarian doctrine, it is essence, albeit a personifying Sophianic essence, that is one, whereas the hypostases are in principle plural. The lurking and somewhat disturbing emptiness of our selfhood witnesses to us that there can be other selves, in a way that the continuity of the earth, sea, air and sky and light does not, nor inversely the absolute specificity of this rock, this beach, cottage, jug, and so forth. So I think that instead of claiming Bulgakov as a modern post-critical thinker, which some people do try to do, some people try to see him as definitely post-Kantian, I think that one can rather situate him alongside Augustine and Pascal and Kierkegaard as another great Christian theorist who, by re-emphasizing subjectivity not as a mode of knowing, but subjectivity as a mode of being, rather more in the way that Descartes does to some extent, and even one has to say Fichte. One is also insisting on the primacy of a constitutive metaphysics as a holistic speculation, which our very existential perplexity cannot really evade. However, Bulgakov develops what one might call a metaphysics of the spirit in a novel way, which is metacritical as well as pre-critical, because, as we've seen, he rounds upon critical thought by stressing the primacy of language in a way that goes well beyond the remit of most pre-critical thought. Quite simply, the primacy of the modern knowing subject, or the subject of the enunciation, is trumped in a novel way by pointing out that this is always also the grammatical subject or the subject of the statement. But with the primacy of the statement comes also the co-primacy of the predicated thing and its copulative link to the subject. So one finds, as it were, an alternatively modern way back to realism. All the same, this romantic and metacritical neorealism is not just identical with pre-critical realism, to the extent that, first of all, it emphasizes that our only access to the externally real is through acts of expressive appropriation. And secondly, to the extent that it realizes, and there's something rather like Whitehead going on here, that it cannot actually think any reality whatsoever outside the assumption that all of nature approaches in its structures both the subjective and the propositional. This is not, however, a matter of our fated and self-deluded propensity to project ourselves onto being. To the contrary, the fluidity of words as between subjects and predicates, as identified by Bulgakov, rather shows that we only begin to be as subjects at all by identifying with predicates already bearing within themselves some degree of subjectivity. The best way to put this is to say that there's a kind of totemism at work here. I don't wrongly see the stream as a nymph. I only begin to have any sense of self in the first place by partly identifying with the stream as with stone and tree and plant and bear and so forth. So that if you like, this sort of almost universally primitive human sense of animism has some truth to teachers still. All this amounts to an implicit claim in Bulgakov that a real linguistic turn returns us to metaphysical speculation rather than deepening the Kantian epistemological project. This then constitutes a challenge to most of analytic philosophy, at least in its Fregean and Wittgensteinian modes, although recently people have suggested that the very early G. Moore was saying something like that, and that this is sustained in Whitehead's work. So similarly, Bulgakov's whole sense of the importance of the person or the subject is not about looking at things from the human point of view. On the contrary, his idea is that the subject, in terms of feelings, emotions, creativity, existential experience, is fully a part of reality. It's just as real as stones that we bump into. So this is another way you can connect Bulgakov with Whitehead, that he's totally against what Whitehead called the bifurcation of nature. He's insisting that the subjective, he's insisting, if you like, on the objectivity of the interior, which is the way an Italian philosopher, Michele Sciacca, put it. That's precisely the kind of thing that he's trying to say. And I think for this reason, it can be concluded that Bulgakov's critique of modern, non-religiously based philosophy by no means accepts its critical starting point, which for him is identical with an impossible foundationalist bracketing of religion. Instead, Bulgakov offers us a Trinitarian ontology which newly accentuates the place of the subjective person only because it also newly accentuates the importance of things, of community, and of creativity with respect to all of nature, with humanity as its crown. Very much, I think, in keeping with what Pope Francis likes to call an integral ecology. A still more biblically infused philosophy can in the future lead us in Bulgakov's wake through grammar towards wisdom, since the lesson of both is that personhood and essence are to be distinguished, but never divided. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Milbank. We will have now 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the panelists and from the audience. We already have one question from the audience, but I think we should start out with the panel. Giulio and Edward, do either of you have any questions?
Well, thank you, John.
Thanks. Hi, Edward.
I would have rather two simple questions. I am not an expert in sophiology, and I have read from Bulgakov only a little. First, would you identify or in some sense his Sophia with this ontological propositionality you have just now described? So
completely, yeah, completely. There are sort of two main elements in Bulgakov. On the one hand, there's this thing about that reality is subject, predicate, and copula, and on the other hand, there's Sophia, and they're both about exactly the same point. And the point is relativizing the distinction between essence and personhood, so that just as he's saying that the predicate and subject are so fundamental to each other that there is no subjecthood without essence and there's no essence without subjecthood. So also the whole point of Sophia is to say that the divine essence is not something impersonal. It's not a fourth hypostasis. It's what he calls a kind of hypostasizing power. So that, and inversely, the persons of the Trinity are not kind of empty centers of free will. They have tropes, as the Cappadocians put it. They have characters, and they have character, they have content because of their relationship to essence, which in Greek physis, which also has the sense of character, if you like. So that it's very much to do with a mode of personalism, which to my mind is vastly superior to the thinking of somebody like Zizoulas, because it doesn't denigrate things. It's not dualistic. It's not kind of subjects versus objects. It's trying to say you need both subjects and objects, you know, and this is why I think also it's very germane to our ecological crisis. So if I'm going to relate it now, if we're going through now the first episode of our long-running crisis with nature, our relationship with nature, then absolutely we do not need modes of neo-Kantian personalism. And actually that would be a bad kind of Trinitarian ontology. We need a mode of personalism that is able to do justice to essence and nature. You know, there's three persons in one essence. That's what we've got to reflect in our Trinitarian ontology. And this is one reason why I think that Bulgakov is so interesting. And so very much, yes, the grammar thing and the sophiology thing are saying something very similar. And it's about this kind of fluidity between essence and nature, and between, if you like, the sort of the open primacy of the first subject position, and then its relation to other things and to other people. But we are absolutely connected, and yet that doesn't sort of abolish our freedom. And so that in terms of Bulgakov's Trinitarian theology, there's a complex interplay with insisting on the monarchia of the Father, and yet, you know, the absolute co-primacy of the other persons.
Thank you. I think we can have another question, but we do have one from the audience that's very relevant. We just had a question that asks, according to your last remark, John, is it possible to talk about in Laudate Si, a new Trinitarian ontology as proposed by Pope Francis? That is, do you see in the latest papal encyclicals something suggesting a Trinitarian ontology, perhaps as it relates to ecology?
Yes, completely. I think that the end of sort of Laudate Si very much sort of, you know, hints towards that. I've got an essay coming out, and a paper I also gave in Krakow. I don't think it's published yet, where I try to talk about the importance of a Trinitarian ontology in relation to ecology, and again, it's sort of rather about this balance between the personal and the natural, and something like the need for, you know, not denigrating the human in terms of our concern for the natural world, and it not being an either or, and indeed the importance of, to some extent, theology appropriating some of the things Bruno Latour says about nature not being all one thing, but a whole series of actors, that, you know, that if you like, the personal doesn't just begin with us, but that something like this subject-predicate structure is there throughout nature. Well, there's a lot more that could be said about all that, but yeah.
Undoubtedly. One of our earlier questions from the audience was, how can you distinguish the subject as the Father and the subject as also the Son and the Holy Spirit as persons? I think they're asking, how can you distinguish the subjectivity of the monarchical subjectivity of the Father from the hypostatic subjectivity also of the Son and the Holy Spirit?
Yeah, so it's a really, really important question in relation to Bulgakov, because of this kind of fluidity between essence and persons, you know, there are various points where he seems to say, both in relation to Christology and the Trinity, that you could almost reverse the position of the Orthodox formulae without ever quite doing so. But nonetheless, in the Capital de Trinitate, for example, he does suggest that there's a sense in which only the Father has full personhood, that in other words, the personhood of the Son and the Spirit aren't sort of simply other persons, because that would sort of damage the divine simplicity. It's as if they're kind of, in some sense, repetitions of the divine monarchic personhood. And yet, obviously, he's trying to, in saying that, he's trying to avoid modalism, if you like. But nonetheless, it in a sense, it's a very apophatic move that he's saying that, you know, okay, one person in three natures, but only if you realize that it's almost, you can almost say one person in three essences as well. And you need to at least entertain the idea that that's not completely false, especially remembering the fact that, you know, this original terminology is extremely fluid, you know, that you know, ousia and hypostasis, you know, and so that, you know, to get too caught up with the idea that there's an absolute distinction between the two, runs the risk of being too cataphatic, I think, for Bulgakov. But as I say, I mean, I think the most important thing to realize is that in terms of sort of ontology, that, the predicate position is always sort of tending towards, the more it becomes co-fundamental, the more it tends to being another subject, you know. And so we already experience that in human community. And in divine terms, it's even truer, because in the case, you know, I'm associated with all the things in my study here, and then I'm associated with you, but God is only associated with the personal, you know, for him, for the Father, the predicate is entirely and utterly personal. We only participate in that.
We have a question about how this relates to Thomas Aquinas. Eric Road asks, in God's I am that I am, there is within the predication an existential with the same subject and copula. The predicate here is a sheer existential I am. So he's asking, I think, how it is that the predicate as a sheer existential I am is in surplus of subject-predicate relation, and whether you see a correspondence here with Thomas Aquinas and aspects of the new theology.
It's a really great question, and you know, and there are passages in Aquinas that you could try to read in a Bulgakovian way. That Aquinas is never forgetting the fact that he's taken the metaphysics of essay from Exodus, you know, that it's not simply, you know, the Bible, it doesn't say God is being. On the contrary, God says, I am that I am. So that, you know, this is exactly the way Bulgakov wants to read it. He wants to say that being is never separable from language, because it's an articulation, and it's always a copula. It's never an empty being, and that's exactly how he would read the idea that God is being as such. And I think that, well, in my own with Catherine Picksock Truth in Aquinas, but elsewhere as well, I have tried to suggest that this thought isn't completely alien to Aquinas, that he doesn't really want to separate his metaphysics of essay from a kind of Trinitarian metaphysics, and that so God's being is an utterance, you know, and it's the unity of the subject and predicate in that utterance.
We have a question about the kenosis. Dr. Jacqueline Service asks, Bulgakov places kenosis at the heart of sophiology, where kenosis is the triune foundation. Do you think this idea could be seen in his ontology of grammar? She also says, where subject, predicate, self give to one another. So there is a kind of kenosis that is the grammar in the image of the Trinity.
It's a really, really great question. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's right. And I didn't say very much about the kenotic aspect in Bulgakov, and certainly he does have the idea that God is, you know, inherently kenotic, because he's Trinitarian, and surely this must connect with what he says about language and reality, that sort of we only have identity, as it were, by emptying ourselves out into things, and things only sort of acquire identity by sort of emptying themselves into us, so that, you know, Adam has to name the beasts for the beasts to become fully real. You know, but yeah, I like very much that one would think of that as kenotic. Yeah.
Well, we have a provocation from one of the final comments. He asks about Hegel and Feuerbach. He writes that the Hegelian Feuerbachian would claim that the metaphysical realism is itself the source of individualism and alienation. How would we start to respond to this contestation?
Gosh, I'd have to know more about it. So this is sort of more Feuerbach than Hegel, although I can see how, yeah, it could be Hegel. And I suppose that depends. That if you have this sort of negatively dialectical attitude, you tend to think of the moment of predication as being something like a moment of alienation, that you need to do it to become something, but you're also alienated from yourself in doing that, and so that's got to be cancelled out. And well, the point is that the more romantic trajectory of German philosophy that Bulgakov is developing here insists, on the contrary, on the absolute primacy of artistic expression, aesthetic expression. So there is no logical route from the subject to the predicate. It's not completely arbitrary either in their perspective, because it's sort of led forwards by the teleology of beauty. So I suppose, yeah, you could have a suspicious kind of Feuerbachian critique of that. But I think that the metacritical response is always that somehow this rests upon either the idea that there is a sort of fundamental subjectivity that's not fully out there in the world, yet, you know, and this is, you could just argue that that's not true, that subjects are fully part of the world, or it involves some kind of reductivity in terms of things, whereby you're trying to be suspicious, and you're sort of trying to argue away subjectivity. And again, the metacritical response there is, well, we don't have any access to things other than through language. And so all of that obviously could be delusion, but it means that we're totally deluded about an attitude, about a given existential stance towards reality that we cannot ever possibly escape from. And then if you have that level of suspicion, you land up with not being able to explain you know, why subjectivity exists at all, or else you know, why we sort of exist in a way that we could never struggle outside ourselves. Why should that be the case? You land up with mysteries that are far stranger than the mysteries talked about by religion, I think.
It looks like Professor Luigino Bruni has joined us.
Hi, Luigino.
Hi, John. Hi, Giulio, and everybody. Thank you.
I hope you're feeling okay.
Yes, okay. I just was able to follow the last part in YouTube. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, good.
Are there any more questions from the panel? Well, if not, we can continue with Giulio Maspero for our next paper. Giulio Maspero is a professor at the the Institute for the Holy Cross in Rome, and he works also with Professor Piero Coda at the Sophia University Institute in Florence. He was ordained in 2003 as a priest with Opus Dei, and he's a professor of dogmatic theology. He's also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Theology, and he'll be giving us a paper about the relation of Trinitarian ontologies in the conditions of the coronavirus lockdown in light of the recent epidemic.
Just one question, a technical one. Luigino, can you be with us more time, or do you want to talk now? Okay, so I go ahead. So my perspective is the patristic one. So I try to follow what John has just said. He presented the rereading of Fichte by Bulgakov, and that is kind of criticism of modernity from the perspective, the Orthodox perspective. So I'm going backwards, presenting how the fathers, most of all Gregory of Nyssa, read the Platonic tradition. And I think this is kind of unity in this picture, but what I wanted to show in the end is how the crisis, the health crisis that we are experiencing now can be enlightened somehow about what the fathers did, because there is a kind of or revelation of the true Trinitarian dimension of humanity. So there is kind of Trinitarian anthropology emerging from this situation. And we must not forget this lesson, I would say. So my first step comes from a reading of Plato that I owe to my dad, my father, because I used to read Plato in a very Neoplatonic way. So saying that he was against the matter and the material world. And my father used to tell me, no, Giulio is not like that, because Plato was in love with reality. So Plato is not Plotinus, keep that in mind. And I think that what Plato was trying to show was that any piece of reality is beautiful, but is not beauty. So anything concrete here can exhaust the thirst for beauty that we have. And because of that, this tension, this erotic in the proper sense, was resolved referring back to the world of ideas beyond physics. That is exactly metaphysics. So there is a kind of contradiction, a tension in Greek metaphysics, because we have the astonishment before the word, that is the starting point of philosophy, but at the same time, the only way to get to the real dimension is to overcome this word and to go beyond. And in this, Plato committed a patricide according to his words. In the Sophist, he killed, into brackets, Parmenides, because in order to keep this tension between this world and the world of ideas, Plato needed something that is the participative conception of being. So according to Parmenides, there is just one way of being, that is to be one. On the contrary, according to Plato, there is different ways of being. You can be without being, the being with capital B. But from this perspective, okay, you have, you save the human desire, you save the fact that you can enjoy something beautiful here, and climb up to the origin of this beauty. But at the same time, you get a big problem with the many, because you have the one and the many, and you get dialectics somehow. You get also an identification between being and the intelligible. So to be means to be understandable somehow. And this is a kind of reduction. So this patricide that Plato committed with respect to Parmenides was followed by another patricide by Aristotle, who killed, into brackets again, Plato. Because Aristotle tried to get to a pure God who was life in the sense of contemplation, of being pure act. But in doing so, somehow, there was a reduction not to the world of ideas, but to the world of forms. And I would say that Aristotle got to the same result of Plato from a different path. But again, we have an identification of reality with the intelligible world. So the fathers of the church were able to overcome this tension that is present in Greek metaphysics between the one and the many. And they could not commit any patricide because in their view, through the revelation, they knew that the real God is a father. And because of that, we call them fathers of the church. So there can be any patricide in those who are fathers. And in this way, our God, the Christian God, is a very interesting philosophical issue, because God is one and three at the same time, the triune God, who is Father, Son, and love. We can re-express this tension in Greek metaphysics as a tension between the one and the many, and a tension between semantic and syntaxis. Maybe also in what Bulgakov said, this presence of Sophia and grammar is a way to keep together both semantic and syntaxis. Yeah, the fathers could do that, could keep together the one and the many, semantics and syntaxis, because being, in their view, was triune. And so they could keep together differentiation and individuation, because you can be yourself through the relation with the other. In some sense, the problem of Plato was desire, because when you both thought and desire, because he was facing the sophists, and the sophists were using also Parmenides' paradoxes, because Parmenides denied reasoning itself, because if the being is one, you cannot do a reasoning with a subject, a copula, and an object, because you cannot join things together. There is no space for syntaxis. On the contrary, the fathers of the church knew that to be yourself consists in being in a relation with someone else. So your identity, also your subjectivity, is related to a relation, sorry for the words, and at the same time this is connected to desire, because if we think of Platonic eros, desire means that there is something beyond, there is something else, there is another, and because of that, desire is so important in Plato. But at the same time, because of that, in Aristotle, desire was erased somehow by the theological dimension, because the Aristotelian God has no desire at all. He cannot have desire, otherwise he wouldn't be God. On the contrary, the Christian God has desires, because he is Trinitarian somehow. So there is a wonderful coherence from the theoretical perspective between Trinitarian ontology, or the rereading of God's ontology by the fathers, and what we call anthropology. I know that Augustine was accused of projecting an anthropology into onto God, but I would say that Augustine could express the Trinitarian consequences on anthropology, because he had a very clear Trinitarian ontology. And I would say that his Trinitarian ontology has many things in common with Gregory of Nazianzen's, with the Cappadocians. This should be studied more, but there is something there very interesting, I would say. What the father did was a rereading of Genesis, because at the beginning of the Bible, we have that God created everything out of nothing. And this everything was divided through the relations. For example, it's extraordinary to see how we have heaven and earth, we have male and female. So all the world of the cosmos is structured according to relations. And this means that in the Judeo-Christian perspective, the Trinitarian relations are the key to understand our world. Even if someone doesn't believe, that has no faith in the Christian God, secularly here we have something very interesting, because in the end, what the father found was that will is, and because of that desire, is essential for the human being, not only intellect, but also desire. And the second point was that the human being was created in the image of this God who is triune, and because of that is essentially social. You cannot be a man alone. No man is an island. It's not just a verse of a poem, but is a Trinitarian ontological and anthropological truth. And I think that now we should stress this. On the contrary, when you have only reason, there are many dangers of getting to idols, because idols, the very word idol is shares its root with idea. It comes from seeing. And according to Gregory of Nyssa, reason can create idols when it forgets that God is always beyond. The being with capital B is always beyond our ability to catch through concepts the true meanings of reality. So in the Cappadocians thought, we have a criticism of Platonism, a very clear criticism, because you cannot reduce everything to idea. And also there is the danger of thought is highlighted, thought alone is highlighted. But at the same time, we could say that the Cappadocian kept working on what Plato did, because they protected human desire and founded this experience of beauty, this astonishing before the world, that also moved the first philosophy. So somehow Trinitarian ontology is the accomplishment also of the philosophical movement, of the philosophical action. And I know that in modernity we have a third patricide. So we have the first one with Plato with respect to Parmenides, then the second one with Aristotle with respect to Plato. And in modern time we have Nietzsche, who somehow in the name of will killed the Socrates and the Platonic tradition. But what we have in Nietzsche is that the idols come back to the world. And there are not only modern idols, but also postmodern idols. Pierangelo Sequeri, some years ago, wrote a wonderful small book, an easy one, I would say, that is untypical, because Pierangelo Sequeri uses to write very dense books. But this is a wonderful booklet on the postmodern idols. And now, in the present health crisis, I would say that these idols are in crisis according to the etymological sense. They are in court. And these idols, according to Pierangelo, are eternal youth, indefinite growth, communicative virtualization of identity, and secularization of freedom. So in these months, in the past months, we experienced just the crisis of these idols. They are connected to a secularization of the Christian thought, somehow a secularization of the Trinitarian thought, I would say. So the modern and postmodern idols are secularized Trinitarian ontological ideas or truth, I would say. But now, in this moment, we are experiencing something very useful, I would say. It's a wonderful moment now, because of the pre-virus society was built on these postmodern idols, and somehow against the 9th and 10th commandments. Everything was in a consumeristic society was related to desire of what the other have, and also your identity was connected to what the other were expecting you to be. So postmodern society is the contrary of realism somehow, because we have killed the father. So we live in a society that is driven by patricide. On the contrary, in this month, we experience something disruptive, I would say, but very, very interesting, because we couldn't expect our identity from outside. We were closed inside. Also, previously, in my experience, in my pastoral activity, people were exposed to a lot of frustrations, but false frustrations. So if the weather is bad, this is frustrating. If my my look is not as I expected, this is frustrating. And so there are many suffering related to nothing somehow. Oh, related, better said, related to our relational dimension that was not taken into account from the cultural point of view. On the contrary, now, in this month, I would say that we can experience the force, the power of Trinitarian anthropology, because we were closed inside and we discovered the value of relations. We can escape the idol of consumerism and all the postmodern idols that come from the secularization of Trinitarian ontology with modernity, or with a sort of modernity. Now we are freed somehow by this crisis, and maybe we can define what happened as the fall of the Berlin Wall of liberalism and consumerism, because in 1989 it seemed that globalization, consumerism, finance had gained the war, and the Western countries were fighting for a few decimal of their GDP, and so on. We were following the economical development a lot, and that was very important. Now, the situation is completely different, and now we are counting our losses in tens and not decimals of percentage points. And most of all, we cannot feel our desires just through consumerism. We cannot find our identity just looking to our images. So I think that now we can go back to relations, to also the dimension of the family, and the idols of limitless growth and eternal youth are falling down. And so maybe we can discover something new that is in our tradition. So we can go back to the roots and discover what we have in a Trinitarian anthropology that is the consequence of the Trinitarian ontology, or the different versions of Trinitarian ontologies that we have. So maybe now is a time for taking care of relations and discovering how our democracy can go completely crazy because it becomes show business, and everything becomes manipulation, and not only through the TV, but now also through the social world. Now we have to talk about biopolitics, psychopolitics, and so on. But the way out of this is Trinitarian anthropology, I would say, and the value of real personal relations that now we can appreciate more and more, because we were deprived of them. We were closed in our houses, and that was terrible somehow. But I think that a time comes now where we can take advantage of what we inherited of this Trinitarian, patristic Trinitarian ontology that is the base also of what Bulgakov did, for example, of many rereadings of the modern authors that are wonderful and did their job. But now we can develop a Trinitarian anthropology that is the consequence of a Trinitarian ontology. And this is a wonderful opportunity. I would also make an, I don't know, ask people to join forces, because there is a big risk now of removal, because it's a psychopathological way out of problems to remove the trauma. Now we should help people to think to what happened, because there is a message, a wonderful message there. There is a message of hope in the crisis that we are experiencing, and the world is in need of a thought that is able to take care of relations and to help people to discover how their real identity is in relations and not in what images or people outside expect from them. And that's all. Brian.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Giulio. It seems that we have Luigino Bruni now to join us, as well as all of our other panelists. Would our panelists please like to pose any questions following Giulio's magnificent talk?
It was this is more in the way of a comment that talking of patricide, it's interesting that Bulgakov seems to have a stronger relationship to Fichte than he does to either Hegel or Schelling. And you might have thought, well, Hegel and Schelling say an awful lot about the Trinity, and Fichte says nothing about the Trinity. So why should that be the case? And I think the answer is precisely that he thought that Fichte was the least parricidal of the three, because Fichte insists on the importance of the primary personal subject. It's sort of not abolished in favor of logic or of a kind of blind nature, as Bulgakov saw it. So that he, he absolutely wants to begin with this, primacy of the personal, but then he wants to go on to insist on relationality, as I've said. So I suppose the only question I would have would be, Giulio, would you see that in terms of sort of relation, we do somehow have to bring into that our relationship to matter, if we're going to stop using things badly, don't we need to sort of use things sacramentally?
Yeah.
That our relations are, if you like, mediated by the way we use things. Yeah,
we should learn to look through, because
yes.
I used to look at, and for example, when we use something, we don't think about the person who produced that, who were part of the process of getting to that object. So this is very important, and this is also a contemplative perspective. So we have to go back to Plato in a Christian way.
But that must mean it's important to value, the beauty of things, and to value, the things of nature, for themselves, because they're proclaiming the glory of God.
Yeah.
Whether we're there or not, in a sense, although also obviously through us.
Yeah, so Balthazar project was based on that.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Julie, can I ask a question?
Yeah. Hello, Luigino.
Hello, John. I am very, very, very happy to be here with you, all of you.
Delighted.
No, my question is about idolatry or idols, because in these years, studying a bit the prophets that are very much against idolatry, more than everything in the Bible. At the end of my reflection, that I think that in the Bible there is something, I would say, not so clear and not so, would say, excessive about idolatry. Why? Because, in my opinion, because the idea, yes, I understand the reason of the distinction, to distinguish Yahweh from other gods, or maybe from other idols, because in the Bible it's not so clear that all other gods are idols, because there is also a distinction between true other gods and just stupid idols like in Jeremiah and so on. But I think this the idea that everything other people's worship is just rubbish, I think is something that, for instance, think about the Catholic Church. Sorry, John, if I refer to the Catholic Church, but the same idea of the sacramental reality. No, that reality tells something important in itself, then things are not God, but creation, and in things there are also important messages for us, as also John was saying now. Then I think the idea that to call, like, I don't know if you remember in Moby Dick, dialogue between Ismael and the indigenous Pequot about, but you think Ismael was reflecting it. You think that God is jealous of stupid piece of woods? No, the idea that I think after 2,000 years of Catholicism, of sacraments, of icons, of reliquie, all these stuffs that we call sacramentalia, I think we need a reflection about idolatry that, in my opinion, must be a bit more complex than to say consumerism is full of idolatry, or yes, this is true, but we need a theory of idolatry. I think that is not easy, because to call idolatry without a theory, I think is not easy. Maybe it's not very fruitful, according to me, but this is just a question.
Well, and if you think about the way that, sort of perhaps legitimate demands to remove some statues are now turning into full-scale iconoclasm. Yes. In my country and in America, that does require us, I think, to have a very deep reflection about images, and that there are books by my friend James Noyes and by Cambridge scholar James Simpson suggesting that iconoclasm has a very, very dangerous history and a very dangerous linkage to violence against human beings. In the end, so that I think Christians have to ask themselves, in the initial smashing up of pagan idols, what and by the way, as my son reminded me, in fact, many pagan statues of pagan gods were deliberately preserved. So we have to ask, why did they do that?
Even in the Vatican Museum.
That's right. That's right. And of course, in a way, that's the start of the museum. When the pagan idols are put in the museum, that's the beginning of the museum. But I think that I'm sympathetic with you, and it's interesting that how you find in Ireland and in parts of Scandinavia, there's a sort of uniquely slightly more sympathetic approach, to the earlier gods, and monks deliberately preserving their myths and realizing that the gods kind of mutate into fairies and this kind of thing, that a sense that there was some kind of sacral mediation going on there. So this is a very huge question, and I tend to think that the point in the maybe the point in the Old Testament is not that you're denying sort of mediation and images, but that you're making the bold claim to image the ultimate God. That most cultures have some sense that there is an ultimate God, but the Jews are claiming that really we can get to that and mediate that.
But probably John. Sorry, Giulio. I'm influenced by the beautiful reflection on icons by Paweł Florensky. When Paweł Florensky said the Madonna of Vladimir is not just a representation of the Madonna, is the Madonna.
Yes.
Yes. And Florensky is not, I think, idolatry there, then the distinction between adoration and veneration of icons. But when you go to Russia, when you go to the Orthodox, there is something interesting in this idea of icons as a representation.
Well, it's like when Bulgakov says, when you say the Jesus prayer, this is directly Jesus present. It's the same. It's the same kind of Russian attitude. Yeah.
Sorry, Giulio.
With the Trinitarian ontology, you can answer that problem because, for example, if you read Jean Danielou says that paganism is good because is the acknowledgement of the
Plurality.
Yeah, also of
the divine shining through beauty. Yeah.
Yes. So, and also what you said in the Vatican Museum, there are a lot of idols into brackets, but because if you have a Trinitarian ontological perspective, you can take the good and recognize the desire for true life, because criticism of idolatry was not criticism on the idol, but on the lack of life that was coming from the idol. If you know very well the Psalms, you commented them. So
yes, also Jeremiah also. Yes.
Yeah, but if you become as the idols you adore, because if he's dead, you will become dead. So the criticism is soteriological, is not on the act of worship of even nature that is good, because the real God is the one who gives life to you. And this is the point. And God could act in a relational way, even more. God usually acts in a relational way because he is Trinitarian. And so I think that just this Trinitarian approach that joins ontology and anthropology can take the good element of a criticism to idols without denying the value of non-Christian religions. This is essential, I would say. So thanks a lot for your remark, because I didn't want to say that non-Christian religions are bad. Even I could say the modern religions or postmodern religions are not so good, because to adore a screen is not the best. But there is something there. There is a desire there for salvation. So they are good also. We should recognize the desire.
On that note, we have two questions on desire from the audience. The first one asks, when you speak about God's desidere, I think you must change also the Greek concept of desire, that is, to change the idea that desire is always the inclination to something we lack, but God's desire comes from his power to love something that has nothing except the capacity to be loved.
Yeah, so this is the big shift in Christianity, because in the Platonic perspective, desire is necessarily connected to the lack for something, for the desired reality. On the contrary, the Christian God can desire because he is a source. So this is the most important metaphysical novelty, because the Christian God is infinite, so he can be a source. On the contrary, the Greek metaphysical God was finite. This is a key element. So thanks a lot for the question. So as C.S. Lewis said, the Christian God doesn't love someone because he's beautiful, but he makes beautiful those who he loves. So this is possible because he's a source, because he's infinite, and because he acts through relations, creating relations. So I think that this is very important.
The next question on desire asks, a question about desire and love. Should we today still talk, like Dante does, about a hierarchy of loves, loving human beings and angels, and about political right ordering other loves?
So I would talk about a relational hierarchy of loves, because I think that the medieval project was a contemplative reading of the world from perspective of the Trinity. So I would say that Middle Age was a Trinitarian ontological time that maybe got crazy, desiring to do too much. But the starting point was very good. I think that Solovyov's reading of Middle Ages is very interesting in his doctoral thesis, the criticism of the Western philosophy, because he said that there were three moments in Middle Age. The first one where a tradition that he calls auctoritas was above ratio. Then in Middle Age, they got to an equilibrium where there was a relational understanding of ratio and auctoritas. And then maybe with nominalism and the last part on Middle Age, there was an inverse relationship, but this is very complex. I wouldn't, but I would talk of a relational hierarchy. This is very important.
Going on from that, the next question we have concerns the totality of human relations that we have. Gabriel writes, just to highlight the biblical background of Gregory in the dialogue with Plato, he uses the Greek word epidemia in the Canticorum, the Song of Songs, in regard to the incarnation of the Word in the womb of the Virgin. Could it be possible to talk about an epidemia to heal the pandemic situation in the relational perspective of Gregory and his use of sacred scripture?
Yeah, wonderful question. Thanks for the question, because I'm in love with Gregory and with the commentary of the song. And because the Song of the Songs was a kind of scandal for the Christian thought at the beginning, because it was very passionate and material. So the images are very clear. It was a poem used for the liturgy of marriage. And what was wonderful was that it was relationally reread as a symbol of incarnation. So the first point in the commentary of the song is to say that we shouldn't read the biblical text in just a bodily way, but in the same time, Gregory, who is probably that he was married, stresses a lot the bodily images in that commentary, because matter is essential, because the word became matter. So even desire is presented in a very material way. Epithemia is presented as the desire, the sexual desire, I would say. And the image, the best image for incarnation is the bed where the spouse and the bridegroom join. So it's clear that there is no refusal of the matter. At the same time, everything is read in a relational perspective, because according to Gregory, the true meaning of the song is epectasis. So epithemia, desire, passion, should be read from the end. That is from this becoming one with God, who is infinite, and that because of that is always happening, but at the same time is never accomplished, because he's more and more. So we grow in the participation in God. This is wonderful, because there is fulfillment and desire at the same time. It's a wonderful synthesis, I would say.
The last of our questions brings us back to a synthesis of some of the things we've been talking about concerning how we name things and how our naming creates idols. Jacqueline Service asks, humans become like that which we worship. Idols are formative of false ontologies. So can we perhaps say that we have constructed false ontologies, and perhaps that the pandemic has created a rupture within which we can see the possibility of thinking of an alternative ontology that wasn't shown before?
Do you want to answer? I agree with the proposal. Yes, I completely agree. But
yes,
I don't know.
You said, for instance, that we shouldn't forget the trauma of the pandemic, because the trauma has, as it were, opened up a wound within which we can explore things that otherwise would have been forgotten.
Yeah.
Yes. Just to conclude this panel, we can go on afterwards, perhaps to Luigino. But I thought recently that the recent political conflict that we have is following from many of the previous biopolitical conflicts that we've expressed in the past, both as it were with the virus as well as with the ecological crisis. And so in a certain sense, we're not just talking about one crisis at the present time, we're talking about a cumulative crisis that has been compounded on a political stage. And it seems like our contestations about language are another way of negotiating that, both as they can deceive us in showing us things that we desire but ought not to, and also ways in which we can conceive of things that we ought to desire that hadn't previously been allowed to us.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of good poverty, because when you lose things, you understand what really matters. And so it's a tradition not only in the Christian world, but also in any religion, to have fastening and moments where you, let's think of Ramadan, where you willingly lose in order to recognize the gift. So I think that what happened is a kind of word retreat where we are experiences the relational dimension of the word, and that makes it possible to be grateful for the word that we share.
On that note, I would like to continue to our next paper. Now, I know that Luigino Bruni is joining us.
Yes.
I would like to offer the occasion to you, Professor Bruni, if you'd like to take it up to offer your paper now.
No, for me it's fine. I'm quite ready for. Not first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, because I am quite honored to be invited by theologians, in particular by important theologians. I met both of you a few years ago with John. We also had the chance to be speakers in few congress, and also to edit a special issue on economic theology a couple of years ago with Paul Olsington, because part of my research now is on the relationship between I wouldn't say theology, because theology is a science, and I have a respect for the sciences of the others, but biblical studies maybe more, because I try to study also from that perspective, but theology is too much. But today I will try to say something also on that, because I'm also in dialogue with the theologians. I work since 20 years with Piero Coda in Sofia, and then other people working in this particular. But my presentation would be also some questions to you, in particular about one issue, the differences between a relational theology or Trinitarian theology, why we need to use the special Trinitarian, and that it is not enough to say relational theology. So in which sense, in particular, when we try to dialogue with social sciences, which can be the added value of use Trinitarian ontology instead of relational ontology, which is the added value of Trinity, when we have to dialogue with economists, with sociologists. It's not a matter of language, but to say, the differenza specifica of Trinitarian ontology with respect to general, of course, any relationality must be qualified, because there are many forms of relationality, but it's not so clear to me now the added value of using this expression instead of other more secular or understandable to not theologians and so on. Anyway, but I would, can I share my screen, because I have some notes, maybe being my English very poor, probably for John, maybe for Ryan, Eduard, the other people can be easy to follow also the text.
Yes, Professor Bruni, I think you may need to do that yourself.
Yes, if you allow me to share, yes, because host disabled attendee screen sharing is written in my Zoom. Probably you need
what I can do about that.
Probably meeting, or there are some commands that you have to make me that possible.
Let's see.
If it's anyway, I will start anyway also with that. Then if it would be possible, I will do that later.
Professor Bruni, I think you may need to share it yourself on your end. I don't think I can share your screen from my computer.
No. Yes, but I must be allowed, because now when I try to share, there is a message: host disabled attendee screen sharing.
Ryan, in participants,
yes,
you should see the list of participants, and
yes.
I think that you can enable Professor Bruni from there.
Make host.
Sorry for that. But
I don't know if I can do that. I might need to make you the host of the event in order to share your screen. Let me give that a try, but we'll have to change it back if you could, please, afterwards. So I'm going to make you the host, and I think you should be able to share the screen then.
Okay, I will. Yes, if it's possible, just to be more precise.
You're now the host. If you could just press share screen, you can probably.
I'm even the host. Thank you very much. I'm so very honored to be. Thank you.
Different party now.
Okay, now, yeah.
We've left your party, Ryan.
All right.
Yes. Seems easy to do that, but this kind of stuff, we have a lot of. Sorry for. Anyway, but I have prepared a presentation in 4 points, quite quick because the time is small. But I don't know what's happened to my computer. But anyway, can you see my file?
I'm afraid not yet.
Not yet.
There is a delay. Don't despair.
Yes, you'll need to press share screen, and then you can choose what screen you're seeing or what screen we're seeing.
That is my goal, but I can't find among all my files the right ones because it's open, but I cannot see. Sorry also to people to the audience. Yes, now I found it. Can you see
it now? Yes.
Trinitarian Ontology and economics?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Just a few words. Of course, what a relationship between economics and Trinitarian Ontology, because it's not easy not to imagine something like that. Even though in history of economics, there were people, economists, trying to put together economics and theology. I will say something more about Wicksteed in few minutes. Or this Italian Emanuele Sella that wrote a book on Trinitarian economics in 1930. Then, but in a very naive way, no? Because according to Sella, Trinitarian mark because 3 are the economic factors: land, capital, and labor. Then we pass from the binary exchange, the barter, to the ternary monetary, and so on. And then the conclusion is interesting. According to him, economics as a possible Trinitarian system is not there, neither among Catholic economists, because the theological culture of economists is nothing, and the economic culture of theologians is poor. There is a respect for the theologians, poor, not nothing. But actually, in the Bible, there is a lot of economy, maybe also some economics. As I try to say in my last works, not today, that the first homo economicus has been the homo religiosus, because the do ut des logic of sacrifice, the concept of debt, the same idea of oikonomia are very deep rooted in the Bible. Then the idea to start to imagine the relationship with the gods or with the God through means a commercial paradigm is very deep rooted in the Bible. It's not easy to understand whether came first the economy or the theology. It's not easy to know if religions took the commercial paradigm or the commercial paradigm took the sacrifice one. I think, of course, there is a sort of double hermeneutics in this kind of situation. But I think the famous pecus, pecunia, no, coming from pecus, that is, of course, sheep. I think pecus, pecunia, money, comes because sheep pecus was used in the sacrifice in the temple, not to pay contract in the market. And then the pecus, pecunia comes from the temple, from the religion context, not from the commercial ones. Anyway, but a methodological note, there are, as I mentioned at the beginning, there are also questions to all of you in the panelists, being the masters on that. I think that social science can dialogue directly with theology without the mediation of philosophy and anthropology. There are people who say if you don't study philosophy, if you don't study anthropology, it's impossible to put together economics and theology, because theology requires the mediation of philosophy. I don't think so. Of course, you need a bit of, because I think theology is itself a science. It's not the sort of the language of reality. And then it's possible to dialogue between two sciences, social science and theology one. I don't think that all economists try to dialogue with theology must be philosophers or must be expert of anthropology, because anthropology is the bridge. I think it's possible to imagine direct dialogue between theology and social science. But this is also a question to you. It's not the content of part one, the Bible and the economy. As you know, the language of labor and economy is very important in the Bible. I just take three examples now. Take the Psalm 23rd. The Lord is my shepherd. You know, this is beautiful, but what does it mean? That in the Bible, the writer in the Bible uses the life and the figure of a worker, like the shepherd, to say something new about God. Then the world of the economy, the world of life, then also the world of labor, offer metaphors, images for try to say something about how God works. And that for me is beautiful, because that is also possible with other works, and not just because, yes, this is true, that the starry sky and the moral law, as in Kant, the critique of practice reason, but there is also the concrete life of human beings that reveals the divine grammar, not just the creation, because also the human activity can offer metaphors to theology. Second, I just go very quickly this part. Second, Jeremiah, the beautiful scene of the potter. Jeremiah was in a difficult moment with a fight with his family, with his compatriots. And in a moment of total confusion, he received a revelation, a theophany, looking at the work of an artisan, the potter. That for me, being an economist, is beautiful. And third, Ezekiel, that as you may know, in Ezekiel 28, we have another story of the original, of the sin of Adam and Eve, that is not a sin of disobedience, but is an economic sin, as you can read. Till weakness, Adam in his beginning was a model of perfection and conduct, till weakness was found in you. Through your widespread trade, you were filled with violence and you sinned. Then the idea that by your many sins and dishonest trade, you have desecrated your sanctuaries. The idea that the original sin, we would say the original, but it's not the language there, but the sin, the paradise lost, was due to a wrong relationship with the commerce, with the economy. That I think is for me, is beautiful being an economist. Then, to Ezekiel, man was expelled from heaven from a wrongful relationship with commerce and the economy. It was a wrongful trade that profaned the sanctuaries. Okay, second passages. The Trinitarian dimension in economics. Where is possible to find something that which can be the way of dialogue with the Trinitarian ontology and economics. But first of all, we must start from the idea that for you is I know for John surely is quite obvious, that the economics is not a relational science. Economics methodology was based on individuals. The center of the methodological foundation of economics is individualistic, but not because it's not about egoism and nothing to do with that. Maybe also, but it's not important, because all methodology, all also the mathematical language requires an individualistic approach. You need an utility function, you need a maximization of that function, you need the agent with the capacity of choosing. Then all the issue of rational choice requires an individual. Then the whole foundation of economics is based on individual. I would like just to say something about Philip Wicksteed. He's an important British English economist, one of the most important of the last century. Was also a pastor of the Unitarian Church in England, was a Dantist, Dante, was a translator of Thomas Aquinas and Dante into English at the beginning of last century, 1905, 1910 is the most important book, The Common Sense of Political Economy. Why is it important? Because Wicksteed is the inventor of this expression, because he was a Latinist, this expression called non-tuism. Non-tuismo in Italian, in English, non-tuism. What does it mean? I don't consider here Genovese because there is no time for that. But the idea of non-tuism in Wicksteed is quite very important, because he said, because his book, very important book, because it was very influential in through Robbins, Lionel Robbins was a pupil, a disciple of Wicksteed, and then Robbins is very influential in 19th century, and then also Wicksteed was important. Then he said, then this book is full of biblical quotation, because he was also a theologian, Wicksteed. He wrote also books on theology, on Christianity, was quite a good, maybe not very important, but was educated in theology. And then he said, the first pillar of non-tuism, no, it's not truism, non-tuism, is that the economic relation is entered into a prompting of the whole range of human purposes and impulses, resting in a no exclusive or specific way of an egoistic or self-regarding basis. Which is that we don't need egoism. Is enough non-tuism. What does it mean, non-tuism? It's often said or implied that the housewife, for example, is actuated by a different set of motives in her economic transaction in the market. He said, the housewife, even when he quotes St. Paul, working with the tents, they're not egoist people. They are trying to do their best when they go to the market for the family, for the community of Christians, St. Paul. But he said, Wicksteed, the economic relation or business nexus is necessary alike for carrying on the life of the peasant and the prince, of the saint and the sinner. Then he said, in this attitude towards himself and others at large, be careful, at large, not a personalized relationship, a man may be either selfish or unselfish without affecting the economic nature of any given relation, such as that of Paul to his customer. Then he said, as soon as is moved by a direct, disinterested desire to further the purposes or consult the interest of those particular others for whom is working at the moment, the baker, the butcher, or the brewer, the transaction on his side ceases to be purely economic. Then he said, what is necessary in economics is not egoism, but not tuism. I cannot search the interest of the person that is in front of me in a market relationship. Not you, not two. I can be interested in everybody in the market except you that are in front of me in a contract, in a commercial relationship. Then for that reason, he say, he said, it would be just as true and just as false to say that the business motives ignores egoistic as to say that it ignores altruistic impulses. The specific characteristic of an economic relation is non-tuism. that I can be interested in everybody, but not in you that are in front of me in the market. That is not very rational or not absolutely Trinitarian, because the others at large is fine, but the other in front of me is wrong. Then, as also Robert Sugden, important economist today, say, the non-twoism is much more influential in economics, contemporary economics, than egoism. Because economists deals with everything today, with altruism, social preferences, but the non-twoism remains very important as a methodology in economics. Then, what does it mean, non-twoism? Means that, just a few minutes before concluding, using this very famous trust game, the relationship, the trust relationship in the market, just to show what does a non-twoism means. If you imagine that two people, A and B, Anna and Bruno, they are within a trust relationship. I don't know, Anna would like to buy in internet a stamp or a book that Bruno owns. Then Anna will say, can you send me your book that I saw in the internet? Bruno say, okay, please, first send me the bank transfer, and then I will post you the book tomorrow. Then Anna can trust Bruno. Bruno now becomes a sort of dictator. In fact, it's a sort of sub-dictator game, because can reciprocate and then to send the book tomorrow, or can be opportunistic and not reciprocate, to take the book and the money, and Anna loses her money without no money, no book. That is then the Nash equilibrium, as we call that, of this book, of this game, is 0-0, because Anna, with a backward induction, imagine that Bruno will be in this position, and for Bruno, 2 is better than 1, and then Bruno will, according to Anna, will follow the no reciprocity action, and then Anna will get -1, that is less than 0. Then, according to game theory, the rational choice of Anna is not trusting Bruno, because 0 is more than -1. This is the typical way of the economist way of reasoning in interpersonal. This is typical non-twoistic approach. Then there are two totally separated people, each one maximize a utility function, and everything is in terms of interest, but not the interest of you, of Bruno. Maybe I can be altruistic with other people in general at large, but not with Bruno, and Bruno not with Anna. If we imagine another, the civil economy, as we call in Italy, approach to the same game, that is a trust game, which is the difference, a possible relational approach to trust. Then a possible approach to trust, because the mutual assistance is, according to Antonio Genovesi, this Italian economist of the 18th century, the economic principle. He said the economic principle is not egoism, it's not altruism, it's reciprocity, it's mutual assistance. Which is the difference of this trust game if you look at it from a relational perspective? Then let's imagine Anna and Bruno with the same situation than before. But now, the benchmark of both is not the possibility for Bruno to get to, and then if the benchmark is 2, and I cooperate with you, of course, in my mind, there is always the idea of losing something, because the benchmark is 2, I get 1 with mutual cooperation. But if the benchmark is 0-0, to say, okay, let's do something together, passing together from 0-0 status quo to 1-1. Of course, I just ask you to be not opportunistic if in one moment, in one stage of our relationship, there will be a temptation. But the benchmark for you is not 2, but is 0. And then market, according to me, is passing together from a status quo of 0, 0, nothing happens, from a mutual beneficial relationship, that is 1, 1. Then it's not a matter of altruism, egoism, it's a matter of reciprocity, of doing together something positive, then passing from 0, 0 to 1, 1. This is the civil economy perspective. Market is not a network of egoism, is not a network of altruism, is a network of reciprocity. Then doing together for passing from 0, 0 to 1, 1. Then my issue, my question to you, is this Trinitarian economics or just relational? Of course, it's not Trinitarian. Because I think a Trinitarian paradigm is a qualified relational one, where relation is substance, not just accidents. The three are equal but not identical. There is an order in the procession, as you know. But which is the risk of the Trinity for a social scientist like me? First, paternalism. Because we know that theoretically in the Trinity there is no hierarchy, but practically at the practical level, for the whole Middle Age up to Vatican II, the Father was not like the Son. We know that. The idea that when you use the paradigm of the Father and the Son, there is a hierarchy intrinsic there. Then we think about the monasticism, the abbot. The abbot is not like the other monks. How to put together hierarchy with Trinity if you use the paradigm of Father and Son? When the idea of family in the Middle Age, when this dogma was created, was not an equal or horizontal relationship. Second, static relations. Someone does always the part of the Father, and other the part of the Son. For instance, entrepreneur, the manager is the Father, and the employees are the Son. Then the question is, how is possible to use a Trinitarian paradigm, forgetting that we used the metaphor of family for 2000 years with an hierarchical hypothesis? The Father is superior to the Son. We know that the theology of Trinity, they say no, they are equal. There is okay, but even in the Gospel, it's not so easy that they are equal. Actually, of course, we know that, but there are many passages where Jesus said that the Father is greater than I. No? Then, how is possible to use a Trinitarian ontology in social sciences, in concrete relationships, in companies, in corporations? Then the risk of fundamentalism, the risk of non-mediation, to take this paradigm and to apply, because I saw that in Catholic social economy, people doing that, to apply Trinity to companies like the economy of communion sometimes, or company with the strong Christian spirit and so on. Okay, there's no time for the COVID lesson now because I'm running out of time, but I think is enough for my question to you. Thank you for your listening.
Thanks.
I just stop share.
Ryan, your mic is off.
I never knew that we could relate economics to the Trinity in such a rich way. This is so very fascinating, and I can already see how it connects to what Giulio had said before and also what John has spoken about. Do we have any questions from the panel?
Yes, I mean, just to comment on your general issue, Luigino. I don't think it's a matter of at a board meeting saying let's apply let's apply the Trinity to our next decision. I'm sure that the thing to do is to talk about the primacy of relationality. But I suppose that people like Bulgakov and Roswell, by the way, Bulgakov, of course, wrote a philosophy of the economy. I mean,
yes,
that's incredibly.
But probably before the conversion.
The reason that people like Bulgakov, Rizmini, Koda want to talk about a Trinitarian ontology, I suppose, is in part because this is a way of saying that relationality is ultimate and absolute, and there's nothing beyond that, and that, for some of the reasons that Giulio was articulating, other philosophical visions don't seem to quite say that. They break down into various monisms, or the opposite, and they don't seem. It seems to be somehow linked to the Christian revelation that this insight into the ultimacy of relationality comes into the picture. And not necessarily, as I was trying to hint, in any naive way, because questions of essence are still involved. But I suppose that in relation to this question about family and hierarchy, well, I mean, obviously, the Trinity, in no simple sense do we use family metaphors for the Trinity, only in a very qualified way. But I suppose, again, the radicalism of the Trinity is to suggest that, as it were, at the very top of the hierarchy or beyond the top of the hierarchy, this kind of equality prevails. And I would suggest, maybe this is controversial, but that actually Christian doctrine, including the doctrine of the Trinity, has profoundly qualified the hierarchy of the family. Even in the Middle Ages, we don't get to the truth all at once, but fathers in the Middle Ages did not have the rights of Roman fathers. They couldn't, for example, execute their sons when they felt like it. So that the sense of sort of reciprocal duty between husband and wife that Paul talks about, and the sense of the need to love your children, and to sort of raise them up to equality with yourself, was there in the Middle Ages, however, very, very imperfectly. And that, as we now know, that included a raising of the role of women, actually, compared to the later period, the Renaissance period. So that, but then also, can I put it to you, it's not possible to imagine a family that doesn't have hierarchy. I mean, of course, a family is hierarchical because, initially people are babies and they have to be brought up. So that I think the point there of having the equality beyond the hierarchy that is the Trinity is it's a sort of reminder to you that the hierarchy within the family, or indeed any other kind of human hierarchy, is provisional. And in fact, the word hierarchy is a Christian invention. It comes from Dionysius the Areopagite, and the whole point of hierarchy there is educational. It's the angelic and the ecclesiastical hierarchies are about raising people up, so that they're not sort of like, you can contrast that with static castes, if you like. If you think of sort of some traditional Hindu models where you're simply destined to your caste forever, that from the outset, hierarchy, that's not what it means. It's not. Its whole semantic range is not to do with that. It is to do with this kind of raising up. And so, because we live in time, because we have different abilities, and because of the need to organize things. I mean, anybody who tells you they're getting rid of hierarchy, don't trust them. They're a liar. You know, they're telling you a political lie. They're not going to do that. It usually means they want to be on top of the hierarchy. You know, so that however democratic we are, you know, and that's something we've seen in the coronavirus. You know what? We have to obey the government. It doesn't matter. You know, democracy only goes so far. In the end, in a crisis, we do have to obey the government. And
yes.
So the question of, you know, authority has to be constrained, but there's also a question of good authority. And the only way you achieve that is, if you like, more internal, that people have to have that sense. And I think that the model of the fatherhood in the Trinity, that in the end, fatherhood is kenotic, it's self-giving, it's indeed only achieved through that self-giving and the giving birth to the Son is a very good way of rebuking bad human hierarchies.
No, I think, John, thank you. If I just can react to 1 second, because as also Giulio knows, because we organized, we did a seminar on movements and charisms and so on, like Focolari, CL, and other reality today. As a matter of fact, when contemporary movement try to take the Trinitarian paradigm explicitly to build relationships, it's very difficult to experience fraternity in an equal way. They become a sort of sacral hierarchy, because there are people who make always the role of father, the responsibles, and people when up to 80 years old, they are always the son. Then, no, this is true. Then paternalism, a sort of to treat people always as teenagers.
We need more sort of kenotic dynamic models.
Yes, kenotic also. I think the mediation of the role of power, because I think we must be very conscious about the limits of human beings. We are not in the Trinity. Limits in terms of power, exploitation, abuse. And then for that reason, I'm saying, being not a theologian, but an economist, for instance, I used in some of my papers in the past the concept of fraternity. The fraternity is not sorority. There is always a gender issue, even in fraternity. You know, there was also a feminist economist who wrote us, say fraternity is a gender biased, is not a neutral, because brothers are not sisters. Anyway, but fraternity, as also John Rawls wrote, is a relationship as if we were brothers, not because then that is because I tried in these years to work on Trinity, but this when we try to pass from theology to social sciences, I need some help, because I saw historically the risk, the mistakes of applying Trinity to interpersonal relations, also because of these cultural concepts that are very, they are fruit of centuries of culture, of interpretation. But thank you for what you said, because it is very important.
Thank you very much. We have one question that's related to this. It seems like one of the central challenges is how we can move, as you say, from theology to the social sciences. How do we, as it were, get from the first principles of the Trinity all the way to the various relations that people enter into in their economic life? Jacqueline asks, we can never make a straight line from the Trinity to economics, as we need to recognize that there is an ontological difference. And I think she means this in a number of senses. One, the difference within the Trinity, perhaps also the difference between creator and creation, and perhaps thirdly, how it is those differences are manifested in a Trinitarian way within economic life.
Yes, in fact, I specify that I prefer, for the moment, I prefer to use the expression relational economics, because a relational is more. But I'm very much tempted to use the expression Trinitarian economics, because I think relational is not enough, because there are very wrong paradigms of relations.
Yes.
As we know. Then, but also Trinity. In other words, to use the expression Trinity today, after democracy, after modernity, after social sciences, also after the studies of economists, lab experiment that we discovered the mirror neurons, we discover how people really act, can also teach something to theology in order to understand what actually Trinity is. Because my problem is that the whole theory about Trinity has been made in a society that was paternalistic, when the father was not like the son. And then the whole mediation, think about convents, monasteries, religious life, they tried to be Trinitarian, because of course Trinity was there, not just since the first Christians, but the sociality we realized was quite not very, we say, horizontal relationship among equals and so on. That for that reason, I like very much the idea of Trinity as a kenosis, the Trinity as a relationship between the way to take seriously diversity and unity at the same time, and so on. But I also see the risk.
Professor Bruni, on the question of the risk, would you say there's a critical potential to thinking about the Trinity in relation to economics? Is there some critical standpoint that we gain from thinking theologically about these relations, and does that allow us to critique current economic modes?
There are few elements that I'm fascinated with respect to Trinity in economics. First, the idea that relationship is not just instrumental, but intrinsic. Because in economics, what is important is this MAG, not the relationship between, thank you, not the relationship between customer and client for buying the MAG, because everything is instrumental for the commodity. That instrumentality is very deep-rooted in economics. Relationships are not a value in itself. Whereas a Trinitarian ontology said, no, relationship is substance, it's not just an accident. No accident, accidents, is substantia, usia, so on. Then I see something important in that you have in a Trinitarian ontology and not in a relational to cure. You need something more for say that the relationship is ontological. But at the same time, if you say that the relationship between John and me is essence, substance, and not just accidents, in human terms, it's not so easy. When I was studying Thomas Aquinas about that, the mutua inesio, this mutual inhabitation, for Thomas Aquinas was very clear that it was just for God, not for human beings. Because he said, if among human beings, the mutua inesio is impossible, because there is the mediation of body. And then it's also not just impossible, but also dangerous to imagine this mutual. But I'm very much fascinated by the idea of the importance, the intrinsic value of a relationship and not just instrumentality. That is an important element for me.
I totally agree, Luigino, and I wonder, whether one can link this to a genealogical story, because I think Agamben has raised an important set of questions, but whether he's got the genealogy completely right, I don't know. Because it seems to me that the overwhelmingly important thing is that you had this Christian sense of an oikonomia, which was the divine providential governance of the world, which it includes necessarily a mediation of the Trinity. And at some point in theological history, you know, probably around the 17th century, and to do with Jansenists, you get this, but Calvinists also, this very, very gloomy view about human fallenness, so that in the natural sphere, God can't any longer govern us through our ethical impulses. In other words, he can't do the economy, the divine economy, any longer through that. Instead, he has to somehow keep order through our bad impulses, you know, so that we get, you know, this idea of private vices, public goods in Mandeville, and we get this idea of the hidden hand. And it seems to me from that also you get the idea eventually in Adam Smith that somehow the economy is something completely secular and amoral, so that, you know, when I'm doing a transaction with the butcher and the baker down the street where I live, I don't have any relationality to them. It's just instrumental.
Instrumental,
and
yes.
I think Wicksteed is right, and that this is not true, and that people do actually partly go to their butchers because they like them, because they're in a mutual relationship. And under lockdown, we've seen this more and more, that people go and get a cup of coffee because they don't want the cafe to close, you know, partly because they like the cafe, but also because the people who run the cafe are their neighbors, you know.
Yes,
and
yes.
It's just a lie that we think in these narrow, non-relational boxes, you know. It's supposed to be very realistic, but it's actually too cynical to be
cynical,
realistic.
Parsimonious, at least. Cynical. No, just one second. What I don't know, because I just know something about what Piero Coda said about Jesus forsaken and so on, but I don't know the theodicea of the Trinitarian ontology, because in Adam Smith, in the first economist of self-interest, there is a theodicea, there is a justification of the evil, because which is the idea, very basic neo-Agostinian approach. There are some bads, some evil, some negative elements in society, like vices, interest, that are recycled by the market. Then the market is a sort of justification of some forms of male.
Absolutely. There's a whole literature in the 18th century saying this. The Odyssey of...
Yes,
I mean, it's obscene. It's theological pornography. You know,
yes, that is
because
true.
It really, it's revolting, you know.
Yes, no, I totally agree that it's not very convincing. But
yeah,
being the economy also a place where vices, interests are there, in a Trinitarian perspective, we need a justification of that. Because if you don't take seriously the limits, the egoism, then my question is, which theodicea you have in mind in a Trinitarian ontology? Which theory of evil you have?
On that question, we need to transition to our last paper, Eduard Fiedler. He's been waiting very patiently. We can continue on with this conversation at the end.
Thank you. Sorry for abusing my time.
Oh, no, it's very wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Eduard Fiedler will be giving the last of our papers. He is a PhD candidate at Maspero University from the Czech Republic. He's written previously on Klaus Himmerl and Trinitarian ontology in Central Europe, and he will be speaking about Comenius and Trinitarian metaphysics today. Eduard Fiedler.
Thank you, Ryan. First of all, I would like to greet everyone from Regensburg in Bavaria. the ancient city of Albertus Magnus, recently deceased Ferdinand Ulrich, or Joseph Ratzinger. As you all probably know, Pope Benedict left his long-term Vatican isolation unexpectedly and visited his older brother Georg here in Regensburg recently. In the shadow of the pandemic lockdown, such a rather quiet gesture, contrasting with the global unrest in our world, could be interpreted as a personal and relational witness to Trinitarian ontology itself. What does it mean? Pope Emeritus was staying in his Vatican isolation out of love since 2013. But now, out of love, he was also moved to his brother. As Benedict stated in 2009, the name of the Trinity is imprinted upon all things because all that exists, down to the last particle, is in relation. All things derive from love, aspire to love, and move impelled by love. So love is governing principle of the aporetic order of the rest and motion, of the solitude and being together, of the inner and outer, and of the aporetic nature of the relationality itself. In our critical situation today, this brotherly gesture reminds us that Trinitarian ontology has to be accompanied by Trinitarian pragmatics, because all that people think, speak, or do is nothing but the practice of metaphysics. The real hope shines always from within this interpersonal texture. This will also be the main thesis of my paper entitled Trinitarian Reconciliation of Being, Comenius and Trinitarian Metaphysics. It is, of course, a great honor for me to participate in this online panel, which repeats the original impulse of the new Trinitarian Ontologies conference held in Cambridge in September 2019. The organizers of the new Trinitarian Ontologies project have witnessed repeatedly a momentous opportunity to collaborate in the construction of new ontologies of the reality as created by the triune God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Following the gracious self-giving of Jesus Christ and its perpetuation in the life of Church, we are invited to raise the simultaneously theological and philosophical question, how to express the meaning of being in the face of the Christologically and ecclesially mediated Trinitarian mystery. This is not a matter of course. Several years ago, I read in Klaus Hemmerle's thesis on Trinitarian ontology for the first time. From the moment God is Trinity, and as Trinity has history in our history, our fundamental human situation, our thinking, and our being, indeed all being, experience a reversal. Since then, I was repeatedly warned that Trinitarian ontology is only a marginal and highly dubious endeavor for a variety of reasons. First, theologians tend to argue that the Trinity should not be postulated as an ontological or epistemological principle of any philosophical system because it is a mysterium stricte dictum. So it can't be properly formulated in metaphysical terms and it has to be sola fide tenendum. Behind this skeptical stance towards Trinitarian ontology, negative or apophatic theology combines itself with the anti-Hellenistic and anti-metaphysical tendency of modern theology. Moreover, strong opposition against Trinitarian ontology comes also from the side of philosophy. For modern idealistic philosophy, the genesis and foundation of Trinitarian ontology in the concrete history of salvation, in the self-giving of Jesus Christ, and the perpetuation of this in the life of Church is acceptable only as a mere provisional moment of religious dialectical development towards a pure triadic protology as expressed in the idealistic system of Hegel. And finally, for phenomenology, Trinitarian ontology terminates any genuine openness towards the limited existence of being in the world too early. Thus, Trinitarian revelation obscures the revelation of being itself in a confused ontotheological manner. All these most familiar refutations of Trinitarian ontology have one significant thing in common. They are based on the pre-established extrinsic relationship between the realm of theology and philosophy, grace and nature. However modern this strict separation is, it is also old enough. It repeats and preserves the ontological foundation of the post-Liberian state. In these circumstances, being qua being is torn apart. The kenosis of the gracious gift of being still opens up the common transcendental home of being generously, but the essential inhabitants of this common home are like strangers, possessing their own subsistence, but always looking for something only virtually and privately good, true, or beautiful. In this pseudo-relational way, their love turns into nothing. They cannot participate in the common and transcendental table and celebrate Eucharistic exchange of gifts. Instead, they are staring into nothingness, accumulating putative and self-sustaining wealth and widening the spiritless gap of quasi-ontological strife and division. Such a perverted love turns being into nothing. But as Klaus Hemmerle, Heinrich Beck, John Milbank, and recently deceased Ferdinand Ulrich declared, actually, in Christ, being is nothing but love or self-giving. Therefore, the indicated pre-established extrinsic relationship between the realm of theology and philosophy only covers this more fundamental division in the post-Lepserian being itself. The Thomistic Trinitarian metaphysics of Ferdinand Ulrich shows that this aporetic division of being points up to the relational unity of both in the triune God, ipsum esse subsistens, analogically, and as Hans Urs von Balthasar suggests, this analogical structure arrived in history in Jesus Christ as concrete analogia entis. However, is this contemplative response to the post-Lepserian state of being sufficient? Just as Jesus Christ could not communicate the mystery of his human and Trinitarian identity by a simple propositional statement, but had to pragmatically testify to the truth through his whole life, death, and resurrection. The truth does not arise in created reality as a pure propositional act, but rather as an act of communication and self-giving from within the network of interpersonal relations. Therefore, being qua being has to be not only properly contemplated and logically expressed, but also reconciled. The original discourse of the New Trinitarian Ontologies Conference was aware of this post-Lepserian malaise from the very beginning. In his opening address to this conference, John Milbank criticized the Socinian modernity with its separation of theology and philosophy, or grace and nature, and emphasized both contemplative and transformative dimensions in the quest for Trinitarian ontology. At the end of modernity, at a time of serious global crisis, the recent renaissance of Trinitarian thought and the proposed Trinitarian revision of metaphysics promise to unfold and nourish an unexpected disposition towards reconciliation and peace. But as Mary asked the angel, how can this be? How can this theoretical Trinitarian revision of metaphysics be plausibly connected with some sort of therapeutic praxis and action? To examine this question, I follow Milbank's recommendation of the Trinitarian metaphysics of Czech and Moravian 17th century philosopher and theologian, last bishop of the Unity of Brethren, Unitas Fratrum, Jan Amos Komensky or Comenius. This recommendation leads us directly into the labyrinth of the early modern world. In Comenius' broad panoptic vision, the religious, scientific, and political crisis of his tragic times was to be overcome by reducing all these areas to their Trinitarian roots. Building on the recent scholarship of the Bamberg Trinitarian School and Czech Comeniology, I will sketch out his panoptic conception of relation between theology and philosophy, and its foundation in his Trinitarian metaphysics, especially in his implicit attempt to connect analogia entis and Augustinian analogia trinitatis. Does this option of Comenius open the alternative to Socinian and Cartesian modernity with its prioritization of subject-centric activity, rational potentiality, and self-sustaining power over sacramental praxis and theoretical contemplation of being? Is this the way in which human soul and creativity harmonize themselves with the originally Trinitarian creation and serves the Trinitarian reconciliation of being? In the year of our Lord, 1642, after 14 years of exile from his homeland, Bohemia and Moravia, Comenius met René Descartes at the Castel Endechest near Leiden for a conversation which Comenius described later with following words. We exchanged speech for about 4 hours, he expounding to us the mysteries of his philosophy, I myself maintaining all human knowledge, such as derives from the senses alone and reasonings thereon, to be imperfect and defective. We parted in friendly fashion, I begging him to publish the principles of his philosophy, and he similarly urging me to mature my own thoughts, adding this maxim: beyond the things that appertain to philosophy, I go not. Mine, therefore, is that only in part, whereof yours is the whole. This concluding statement of René Descartes is illuminating. It is certainly true that his metaphysics was mystically inspired, but it was the mysticism of the absolute spiritual subject, who reconstruct the reality as realitas objectiva from the subject's reflexive self-identification with its thought, ego cogito ergo sum. In this way, Descartes concentrated only on the part. He separated cogitation from the rest of the life of the soul arbitrarily. He left the perichoretic interdependency of the intellect, memory, and love behind. Therefore, as he was confronted with the original Augustinian version of his Fundamentum Inconclusum from Augustine's De Civitate Dei, he refused to adhere to the Augustinian Analogia Trinitatis explicitly. Indeed, Descartes concentrated on the part, but it was a lonely part which does not participate. On the contrary, Comenius' main concern was related to the truth of the whole. He called his own lifelong pedagogical, philosophical, and theological endeavor pansophy, wisdom of the all, or all-knowing. For Comenius, this whole consists of three words or books: the book of the inner mind, the book of the external nature, and the book of Holy Scripture, or revelation. Therefore, any strict separation of philosophical and theological acts wouldn't be appropriate. Nec philosophiam separatim, nec theosophiam separatim, sed utramque conjunctim ides pansophiam. Nor philosophy separately, nor theosophy separately, but both of them taken together, that is pansophy. This broad and reformatory pansophical project, with its conception of a perichoretic relation between philosophy and theology, was based on his Trinitarian epistemology and Trinitarian metaphysics. During the late 20th century, thanks to the discovery of Comenius' so far unavailable works, in particular his Opus Maius De Rerum Humanarum Consultatio Catholica, this fundamental fact was recognized by Czech and German scholars. Namely, Czech phenomenologist Jan Patočka demonstrated that Comenius was driven by metaphysical question from the very beginning of his intellectual endeavor. According to Patočka, Comenius first adopted Aristotle's realistic metaphysics, but in the face of brutal persecution, that of his wife and two children, and forced exile, in the face of the great suffering in the labyrinth of this world, he was looking to transform the metaphysical tradition. In Comenius' vision, the concept of being had to be reinterpreted in the light of Christocentric history of salvation and the transformative task of man. Therefore, after reading Nicholas of Cusa, Comenius amended his original Aristotelian stance towards Neoplatonic participatory metaphysics. Eventually, in his unfinished pansophical Opus Maius Consultatio Catholica, he conceived metaphysics as a descent from the Trinity to a world created by the Trinity and as an ascent from the created world to the Trinity through man's participation in Trinitarian creativity. This emphasis on the practical outcome of metaphysical knowledge does not differ from the main concern of the founders of modern natural science or modern philosophy. However, in contrast to Descartes' dualism, for Comenius, this practical outcome of metaphysics was not determined by the ecocentric predicament of cogito ergo sum, but by the subject's patient obedience to the Trinitarian meaning of the transcendental order of being. As I will show now, this crucial difference precedes the answer to the question of the possibility of a Trinitarian reconciliation of being. How is it possible that the source of truly human scientific culture and political creativity lies in the soul, which is open to the Trinitarian meaning of a transcendental order of being? And what is this Trinitarian meaning? Something less than the being of the Trinity and something more than the created being? Something resident and subsisting in between the creator and creature as a triadic protological structure a priori? Comenius declined this seductive option. Although he was searching for the all-embracing eidetic structure a priori, he never identified it with the self-reflexivity of the absolute subject or with the absolute object subsisting in between the triune creator and his creation. For Comenius, this eidetic structure of being subsists in the triune God exclusively, and all creatures, especially the human soul, intimately participate in this Trinitarian source of being. According to Comenius, the human soul first observes the labyrinth of this created world and learns how to name all things already existing, as in his Janua Linguarum. But immediately thereafter, disappointed by the post-Lepserian malaise, the human being returns to himself and finds in his heart the only true teacher, Jesus Christ, as in his best-known literary work, Labyrinth of the World and Paradise of the Heart. In this way, The human soul remembers what it has already known, that living in the confused and fallen world and interacting with all things existing, it mirrors the triune creator himself. Thus, the basic acts of the human soul are reformed according to the Augustinian Analogia Trinitatis, and the light of the human mind becomes transparent to the Trinitarian meaning of a transcendental and analogical order of being, Aristotelian Analogia Entis. Although he doesn't use these terms, for Comenius, true Trinitarian metaphysics starts at the point where Analogia Trinitatis meets Analogia Entis. This is the actual EuARe, the gate of things. It goes on through the innovatory deduction of the new table of 9 accidental categories from the transcendentals unum, verum, and bonum. Just as the Trinitarian meaning of being is revealed by this transcendental triad, it is also revealed by the categorial reality. Above all, his deduction of categories of relation, ordo, usus, amor, from the transcendental bonum is remarkable. It opens the possibility of a new metaphysical structuring of reality. In addition to the Trinitarian form of a particular thing, which consists of substantia, accidents, and third principle called defectus, Comenius pays great attention to the description of the relational plurality and unity across the created world. He deals extensively with the metaphysical meaning of bipolar combinations, multipolar conglobations, and other structures of explicit personal or factual being together. As Czech philosopher Pavel Floss observed recently, it is probably Comenius who for the very first time in the history of metaphysics uses the word structure as an explicitly ontological term. Thus, his Trinitarian metaphysics is both substantial and relational. Comenius' awareness of the relationality of being also manifests itself in the fact that the pair of the most fundamental terms, being and non-being, is augmented by semi-being, semi-esse, which partly is and partly is not. It introduces becoming, privation, or defect into the metaphysics of the created world. Although Comenius is unable to accurately define creature being as a commune, as non-subsistence like Aquinas in De Potentia 1.1, this metaphysical innovation suggests that he sees the reality of unsecured and unstable created being correctly. For him, created being is neither an absolute identity nor a dialectical potentiality full of contraries, rather semi-being as becoming and balancing under the triune God and over the abyss of nothingness. This creature situation is intimately familiar to him. With Paul the Apostle, Comenius knows that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth, right up to the present time. But the human soul is called to engage with this creature becoming and post-lapsarian defectuality or privation actively through the real participation in the spirit of the Son and the Father, and in this way to collaborate in restoring everything in gloriam triunis Dei. Indeed, according to Comenius, all that people think, speak, or do is nothing but the practice of metaphysics. Quid omnes homines cogitant loquuntur agunt nihil est nisi metaphysicae praxis. But the Trinitarian meaning of this metaphysical praxis is not exhausted by a creative and peaceful transformation of this world. Actually, the culmination of Comenius' Pansophia is a liturgical Trinitarian interpretation of Lord's Prayer on one hand and of the 10 Commandments on the other, everything in gloriam triunis Dei. In this Comenian perspective, the Trinitarian meaning of being can be found primarily in the triune God himself and secondarily in his creation, especially, but not exclusively, in the human soul and its creativity. Comenius avoids being seduced by the triadic hypostatization of Trinitarian being somewhere in a subsisting ideal midpoint between creator and creature. On contrary to Jan Patočka, who eventually saw Comenius as an early forerunner of the Hegelian triadic idealism, the authors of the Bamberg Trinitarian School, Heinrich Beck and Erwin Schadel, and their Czech colleagues, brothers Karel Floss and Pavel Floss, demonstrated that the truly orthodox Trinitarian aspect of Comenius' metaphysics cannot be reduced to a pure triadic dialectical speculation stemming from the protological strife or fundamental division, like in his contemporary Böhme. The detailed analysis of Comenius' reception of the older tradition, Augustine, Gregory of Nyssa, Raymond of Sagunde, Nicholas of Cusa, and of his defense of the Orthodox Trinitarian mystery against anti-Trinitarian Socinians, shows that Comenius connected the fact of the creature negativity with the Trinitarian relationality, but also declined to import the evil or nothingness as a principle inside the triune God. He chose another path than Böhme. Everything in Gloriam Triunius Dei through the Trinitarian reconciliation of being. At the beginning, I sketched out several of the most usual refutations of Trinitarian ontology and linked them with the modern strict separation of theology and philosophy, grace and nature, and more fundamentally with the post-Lepserian situation of the created being. Is Comenius so far presented Trinitarian alternative able to stand up against those objections? First, negative theology warns against any metaphysical transposition of the Trinitarian mystery. It is mysterium stricta dictum. It can't be comprehended exhaustively by the human reason. For the sake of theology, it has to be separated from the metaphysical discourse. Which answer could Comenius perhaps give to this theological critique of Trinitarian ontology? He would maybe point out that the mystery of the Trinity is not diminished or rationalized by his Trinitarian metaphysics, but that the narrowly rationalist and dualistic comprehension of the created order becomes, in the light of the Trinity, full of mystery again. He might point out that the proper Trinitarian metaphysics is not reducible to propositional statements, but it has to be practiced in the midst of the labyrinth of this world through the participation in the spirit of the Father and the Son. All that people think, speak, or do is nothing but the practice of metaphysics. A second refusal comes from the opposite extreme. Modern idealistic philosophy rejects the ultimate meaning of any history of salvation and of Christological and ecclesial mediation of Trinitarian mystery. All this theological junk crusted by the blood of Jesus Christ is acceptable only as a mere provisional moment of dialectic development towards the fullness of the pure triadic protology. Of course, Comenius would never accept such a stance. For him, the spiritual light of the mind is always to be found on the way to Bethlehem and from there back again. He shares the awareness of the triadic explication and implication of being. But for Comenius, the triadic eidetic structure a priori is determined by the anticipation of the ultimate Trinitarian revelation in the history of salvation, above all in the history of Jesus Christ and the life of Church. And finally, phenomenology could argue that the Trinitarian ontology overshadows the actual situation of being in the world and answers the question of being, the Seinsfrage, too early and too easily. Is not the eschatology implied by Trinitarian ontology reduced to the over-optimistic present tense? Is not the situation of human existence radically fragile so that only hope against all hope could mediate the true meaning of being? Was Comenius patient enough? His lifelong chiasm and trust in prophecies seem to indicate a clear inclination towards a radically present eschatology. But his Trinitarian metaphysics resists the most dangerous temptation to hypostasize the Trinitarian meaning of the created being. According to Comenius, except for Jesus Christ, there is no absolute realization of the Trinitarian meaning of being in the confused situation of the labyrinth of this world. Comenius sees the malaise of the created order clearly. He is used to looking into the abyss of nothingness over which the semi-being of this created world in becoming balances. To him, therefore, hope is an actual element of his metaphysical inquiry. But what was he hoping for? I dare to summarize it in my own words. The human soul, by coming out of itself into being, is certainly already in being, always in the Trinitarian meaning of being. Because it is not strictly detached from being, it does not have to replace being with its own human thinking and action. Nonetheless, as the human soul does not fully own being, it remains patiently participating. This participation, however, culminates in the non-identical repetition of what the triune God himself is, spontaneous self-giving and creativity. Thus, before the face of the Trinitarian meaning of being on one hand and of the labyrinth of this world on the other hand, the human soul is tasked with participating in the completion of reality as it already is. What was Comenius ultimately hoping for only for this unum necessarium, one thing necessary, both contemplative and active, for nothing but truly Trinitarian reconciliation of being. I quote him, "But now, if all men are allowed to understand everything in universal light and to possess everything with Christ in his universal kingdom, and to serve him with one consent and to stand with the angels and the world church militant and triumphant and sing together in the same chore, holy, 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 surely it will appear that the everlasting fountains of war are stopped, by the fountains of everlasting peace and joy are opened up, since true unity will be restored to all in all, that is to say, unity within the mind of each individual and between all men's minds and nature and each other, also between all men and God and all men." 350 years after his death, could his hope be our hope too? Thank you for your attention.
Yes, I hope it will. Thank you very much, Edward. That was magnificent. So very rich. There's so much to talk about. So that paper that you gave, it links up with so many of the themes we've talked about today, but most especially I think with John's paper at the beginning. But in a way, it sort of encompasses so much of the sort of product of the Trinitarian relations that we've been exploring in so many different dimensions. What I want to specifically ask about, and hope this will open up the conversation with John especially, is how it is that the Trinitarian relations enter into and open up through the relations of the analogy of being. You said at one point that there is a gateway to things from Trinitarian metaphysics to the analogy entis. And this also, as you said, extends through the various Aristotelian categories. And this suggested to me two things. One, that from the standpoint of Trinitarian ontologies, it's possible to talk about a grammar, not only of the analogy of being, but also all human grammar, by extension, so that grammar isn't, even though it need not be fixed, it can also be creative. By extension, it also extends to the grammar of the categories of things within the world, such that we're able to speak about things, and as it were, we find the meaning of things in the way that we speak about them. And I thought that this perhaps posed a challenge to Bulgakov's conception of the sort of adventitiousness, the sort of spontaneity of grammatical formations, where they're always seemingly sort of in this flux of life and spirit that doesn't yet achieve a kind of fixed form.
Well, that's of course a good question. I have 2 points. First, it's true that Comenius developed his metaphysics, so to say, during a long time. And he was always struggling with finding the proper form of this categorical reality, how we categorize the reality. It was actually highly creative and but fragmentary. One can see that he develops many proposals, so to say, and from this fact, I would suppose that actually for Comenius, this categorical reality as a Trinitarian analogy was also open to this recategorization, so to say, which we can find in Bulgakov and by other authors. So that's the first point. And the second point is a little bit skeptical in this perspective, because Comenius was also trying, like the other authors in this time, to find this universal language, so to say, this mathesis universalis, also this new or universal language which would be connected with the reality of things, and which would be which would comprehend the reality without any reservations. And so he shares this struggle for the universal language, but it could be a question for John. I don't know if this kind of struggle by Comenius, which was for him very important, to find the universal language, is somehow coherent with his Trinitarian metaphysics as such.
Yeah, well, you're the Comenius expert, Edward, and thank you for that beautiful paper. But I would have thought surely there is a connection, because the struggle for the ideal language is a struggle to express the logos, and therefore there's an inherently Trinitarian context about that. And I think it's fascinating that you were sort of drawing attention to the fact that one can argue that the Cartesian cogito is somehow lifted out of the richer context of the Augustinian cogito. And the context of the Augustinian cogito is clearly Trinitarian, you know, and in both cases, probably the cogito is not just epistemological, it opens up towards being, but in a very foreshortened sense, in the way of Descartes compared to that of Augustine. And I mean, the fact that this Trinitarian context for thinking about our existence, our existential dimension, and the relationship of that to time. And I think one of the consequences of removing the Trinitarian context is the relative neglect of time in Descartes, and it only sort of gradually comes back into philosophy, and in such a way that people seem to have never really done with Augustine. But I think that if Augustine is, in terms of the Trinity, making us sort of rethink ontology in terms of more of time and subjectivity, that the striking thing about Comenius, and I think this is similar to Bulgakov, and it's similar to Rosmini, and I think I would argue it's also similar to Erugena, is a preparedness to sort of rethink the categories, rethink the Aristotelian categories in terms of a reflection of the Trinity. So that, as you indicated, Comenius seems to rethink the transcendentals and rethink the 10 categories in terms of the Trinity. And in the cases of all these people, it seems that that does introduce some more personal, relational dimension, something to do with a greater sense of motion and becoming. And as you so well brought out in the case of Comenius, it seems to abolish the practical theoretical division, so that already he sort of has this sense that we cannot but be metaphysicians. We're merely to be living is to conjecture some sort of map of reality, and clearly he is drawing on Nicholas of Cusa here, I think, in saying that. It's all yes, it's completely fascinating, and how there is this convergence between these thinkers in very different times and places, I think, and a task still to be done. I mean, Hamela already suggested that somehow all analogy is Trinitarian, because you don't just see analogy, you're always making analogies, and you're always doing that by expressing yourself through something else, and we can only think of this as a kind of imitation of the Trinity. So, you know, it's a question of trying to put together what all these different people were doing and sort of, you know, building on that, I think. Thank you, anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Does any other panelists have any questions? Just in response to what John was saying previously, it's absolutely true that after Aristotle, beginning with the Neo-Pythagoreans, there's already an imminent recreation and reorganization of the categories. And this factors into the priority of relations in early Christian metaphysics. But it's also, I think, fundamental to Trinitarian ontology in the way that it enters into and reshapes not only the grammar of being, but also how we can begin to then structure any relations of being in the various disciplines that we engage in. And so the sort of imminent creativity of the categories and their various relations then factors into how it is we then begin to speak and construct the various Trinitarian relations that structure other disciplines and their various relations with one another.
Well, I completely agree with you. So, in Comenius, this need for recreation of categories is always connected with this vision of nothingness, so to say, with this vision of privation, defectuality, and to him that doesn't mean that we have some dialectics which will help us to develop the proper knowledge of all, so to say. But it means for him that we are creative. So we are in our creativity. That's the response, so to say, for this flux of metaphysics.
We have one question from Eric Grote. He asks, Edward, if you could please clarify what you meant by the notion of partial being. Is this notion incarnational, temporal, becoming, or does it subsist for Comenius in the Trinity?
You mean this semi-being? So this
semi-being, I think so.
So for Comenius, there are three basic terms: being, non-being, and semi-being. And this semi-being he defines as this somehow fusy is not and is. So it's some kind of becoming in this sense. His examples are from the word of becoming, actually. And to him, this semi-being, with its inner negativity or defectuality or nothingness, has an image or has a source in the Trinity, and that's precisely the Trinitarian relationality, so to say. He discussed quite extensively Böhme in this respect. On the one hand, he criticized him for this import of evil and negativity to the God himself, but on the other hand, he acknowledged this interest in nothingness or defectuality as something important also for the Trinitarian metaphysics. And for Comenius, he says, I think that the problem is that in the Trinity we don't have any struggle, but we have a relation. We have this kenotic relation, which we could find by Bulgakov or Hans-Urs Balthasar later.
It's interesting, Edward, that some of the English followers of Jakob Böhme also tended to somewhat purge those elements from Böhme. So particularly John Portage, who was an Anglican thinker, and it's Portage's Sophia, so that is really later inspiring the Russians. That they're in many ways sophiology is rooted in Böhme, but John Portage gives a rather more kind of orthodox account of this, but a similar sort of interest, trying to think nothing in a more orthodox way. And So and Bulgakov has a whole chapter on Bordage. So the question of sort of people being interested in Burma but worried about Burma is remarkably central in modern theology and philosophy. If you think about Hegel and Schelling as well, and it also means that in a sense, Trinitarian ontology has never gone away. It's often been there in heterodox versions, and right at the core of things with Hegel and Schelling.
Speaking of that, Edward, Luigino Bruni, I believe.
I have to leave, and thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you for this beautiful conversation. Thank you, Edward, John, Giulio, and Ryan.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Luigino. Thank you very, very much.
I hope to see you in Rome or in Loppiano soon, John.
Yes,
Absolutely.
Yes.
Our discussion in the breakfast in the morning.
Yes. Eternal city.
The collateral effect of conferences in Zoom are impossible, no? This formal chat, the coffee break.
Exactly. It's not the same.
See you soon. Thank
See
you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Arrivederci.
Arrivederci. Bye.
Edward, you had previously spoken of the encounter between Comenius and Descartes, and I thought this reflected on both this conflict that we've been describing with Trinitarian ontology and modern philosophy, as well as some of the implications that it had, for instance, of how we think about Fichte and Bulgakov. So you described how, for instance, for Comenius, the idioms of speaking of the structure of being and the categories, etc., are not reducible to the standpoint of the cogito. That is, they can't be sort of singularly reflected from the standpoint of the mind, that somehow they're always sort of out there. And perhaps this might play into what John had described previously about how there's a kind of excess of temporality, perhaps also of creativity, in the way that we want to speak about being in imitation of the Trinity.
Well, again, I can only say that I completely agree. You can see this aspect of his metaphysics also in this awareness of relational structures. That's a very interesting part of his metaphysics, that he has this conglomerations or structures and so on, and he pays a really great attention to discern how looks the dynamics of these relational structures, how they build themselves, so to say, how they create themselves. There is definitely a big role of time in his thinking, above all, this term conglomeration that's of course remind us of our globalization, so to say. And in Comenius, this term, it's precisely a metaphysical term which describes this richness of the relational plurality across the world, and in this dynamics. So it's not a static, space-like order of things.
Very contemporary.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Are there any concluding reflections that you might like to share? If not, Giulio and I were considering hosting another event at the European Academy of Religions next May in Münster, Germany. And so we'd like to invite all of you and perhaps our audience as well to continue to take an interest in this and perhaps to even join us for the panel in the future. And Giulio, I believe you're also interested in preparing a book out of the proceedings of this panel and other associated items.
Yeah, if you like, it will be a challenge, but I think that's interesting to show how Trinitarian ontology and Trinitarian anthropology could help to elaborate this crisis and what happened, to avoid removal that is terrible. This is my proposal, just an idea. also what Luigino said is very interesting. I think that he challenged us, and it would be interesting to answer, to respond.
Very good. Well, thank you all for joining us. This was a marvelous panel and so many rich things to consider and discuss in the future.
Thank you for hosting it so well, Ryan. Thank you.
Oh, yes, my pleasure. Yes, wonderful.
Great, Ryan.
Thank you.
Lot of job, lot of work.
Yes. Well, we can always reflect upon it later. The video will be up on YouTube in perpetuity for our fans to watch in the future. Right. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye all.